there's only one preliminary matter from the committee. So just to let everyone know that Ms. Howden has circulated some questions that she'd like the proponent's Aboriginal Cultural Heritage witness to respond to. She's also recently circulated a second set of questions for Ms. Peace's witness as well, which we will circulate as well. But just letting people know, the people who are calling those witnesses, there might be some questions in there that might be out of scope of the witness's expertise, and if they are unable to answer the question, it's fine for them to just note that when they present. So we'll circulate, Ms. Selvaraj will circulate the second set of questions that came through as well. I just might, we've got a new person at the table. I might just get you to introduce. Oh, you've already got that. Okay, excellent.
Maurice Schinkel, Friends of the Koalas.
Okay, thanks for coming along. Okay, right. So was there any preliminary matters from the proponent?
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any preliminary matters from anyone else, including those online? Okay, good. All right, so I understand first up we have Mr. Lefevre. Am I pronouncing that? Lefevre.
I checked myself.
Okay.
Mr. Lefevre.
Did have a Mr. Funky in the most recent hearing, and that my pronunciation is terrible. So yeah, we're happy to hear. I think we've got half an hour allocated for each of the witnesses. I don't think we've received some indicated that you've got about 10 minutes of questions 4 minutes of questions for each of the witnesses. So we'll come to that once the presentation is complete. Thank you.
Mr. Lefevre, the other day the committee indicated they didn't need us to go through the standard qualifications, so they know who you are, they've seen your CV, all that type of thing. So I'll just ask you about the two documents. One is your witness statement, and that is panel document 36, I think, 37, and a series of slides, which is committee document 64. In both of those documents, is there anything you wanted to add, subtract or correct?
No.
And do you adopt both of those as true reflections of your opinions in this matter?
Yes, I do.
And is that on the basis that the committee is now well advanced with its knowledge of the site, the two-day site inspection, has read the witness materials, and we're now up to day X of the hearing. So perhaps if you could focus on your presentation, keep in mind that 30-minute limit. If you don't feel like you need 30 minutes, please don't take it. But if you need a few more minutes, I think with the permission of the committee, that'll probably be okay.
Yep.
Right, and I think you're going to share from your screen.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, well, I'll pass across to you now, and you can perhaps just assume that the committee knows who you are now, and that probably takes you across to slide 2.
So yeah, my name's Matt Lefevre. So I prepared the specialist assessment A for aquatic ecology. I led the assessments and I've been doing that since 2021. And I was the lead author of that assessment along with contributions from other specialists. I reviewed the public submissions and prepared responses relevant to aquatic ecology. And I've prepared an expert witness statement on which this presentation is based. And since putting together the specialist assessment, I received the revised groundwater modelling and the updated hydraulic modelling. So this assessment was to address the scope of the ER as it related to aquatic ecology effects. And the approach for that assessment of effects was to adopt a kind of standard risk-based approach, which involved determining the values present on site as they related to aquatic ecology, identifying potential effects on those values, identifying relevant environmental delivery standards to address those effects, and then assessing the residual and cumulative effects of the project. So first I'll just run you through existing conditions. I think every specialist has run you through the sites and you've been there yourself, so you know what they're like, but I'll try to relate it to aquatic ecology and the habitats present in the aquatic environment. So first I'll touch on aquatic habitat. So I'll focus on the Gunbower National Park project first. And as you're well aware, there's two water management areas, the Middle Gunbower and the Upper Gunbower water management areas, and I'll step you through those as they relate to aquatic ecology. So the Upper Gunbower water management area is focused around the Camerons Creek system. And water in this system flows into Camerons Creek from the Murray-Darling in the bottom right hand of the screen and flows through a series of lagoons in Camerons Creek, and then it enters Black Charlie Lagoon, which is a big, deep, permanent wetland. I think it's roughly 3 metres deep, which I think is the deepest wetland on Gunbower Island. And then when water levels are high enough, water flows into Bagot Swamp at the terminal end of this system. And unless there's a major flood, water doesn't actually flow beyond this area. It finishes in Bagot Swamp. So in terms of habitat, Camerons Creek supports a chain of permanent and semi-permanent wetlands, and these wetlands support a lot of kind of fringing, submerged and floating vegetation, which provides really good habitat for small-bodied native fish, which you find in pretty high abundance in Camerons Creek. And then similarly in Black Charlie Lagoon, you get on the fringing areas, you get lots of that important complex vegetation for the native fish to hide in and seek shelter in. So these two areas have got really good high quality habitat values for native fish. And then when water levels are high enough, as I said, it spills into Bagot Swamp, and there are some low-lying sections of Bagot Swamp in particular also support some good areas of complex native vegetation. So overall, this system's got some really high quality habitat values for aquatic species. And then in the Middle Gunbower water management area, there's kind of two main sections. In the upstream area, there's the Emu Hole Lagoon and Pig Swamp, which are two semi-permanent wetlands. You can see Pig Swamp, might be a bit hard to see in this picture, but it's kind of shallower depressions that are filled with lots of woody debris at the moment. So they fill up and are semi-permanent. And then Emu Hole is kind of focused around a central, more permanent or semi-permanent lagoon, but it's quite deep at times and holds water for quite an extended period of time. I should mention that all of these photos were taken during the same site visit, so you can see the kind of variability across the project area. And then you move into the floodplain areas, and this is really dominated by kind of classic floodplain habitat that's inundated during more significant floods. And then through this floodplain habitat, there's a number of flood runners and waterways that carry water when there's a flood event. And then adjacent to the project area, there's some larger waterways. So you've got the National Channel in Camerons Creek on the southern edge of the project area. This is the site where the pump station is proposed. Then on the more upper reaches of the Murray, there's the Turrumbary Weir Pool. And then downstream, there's the kind of classic Murray habitat. And then onto the Guttram and Benwell project area, there's the Guttram Forest to the east and Benwell Forest to the west. And these areas are largely dominated by those floodplain habitats. We were lucky to visit this site when it was actually partially inundated after a small flood. So I've got kind of a comparison between the wet and dry conditions in each of these sets of photos. So you've got, floodplain habitat, and then there's a couple of large open semi-permanent wetlands, reed bed and little reed bed in Guttram Forest. And then some other smaller wetland features such as Guttram Swamp and Benwell Swamp in the forested areas. And then, of course, the Murray River adjacent to the project area. So on to the existing conditions in terms of aquatic fauna. So the project area supports fish, both the native and introduced species, 3 species of turtles, lots of aquatic invertebrates, and then 2 species of aquatic mammal. And I'll just focus on the threatened species that we find on site and where you're likely to find those threatened species. So you've got some main channel specialists, and these are kind of the iconic Murray-Darling species such as the Murray cod and the silver perch. Some of these are really, really big fish, and these species are really restricted to those permanent flowing habitats on the margins of the project area, the Murray River and Gunbower Creek. Wrong laptop. And then next up, you have some threatened small-bodied native fish, and all of these 3 species, the southern pygmy perch, the olive perchlet, and the purple spotted gudgeon, actually all went extinct in the Gunbower project area and the Guttram and Benwell project area, and they've subsequently been reintroduced by North Central CMA over the last 5 years. And these species are wetland specialists. You really only find them in permanent and semi-permanent wetland habitats, and because they're reintroduced, they're only found in Cameron's Creek currently. So, yeah, and those reintroduced populations, they're not considered self-sustaining at the moment. While they've been recapturing them, they're still actually actively introducing new individuals. And then there's the Murray-Darling rainbow fish, which is a bit of a generalist species. That species you find living in the more permanent habitats during drier events, but then when the floodplain's inundated, they move onto the floodplain and breed and stuff on the floodplain. And then lastly, there's a catch-all of other species, catfish, platypus, and 2 species of turtle. And again, these species are largely restricted to the permanent and semi-permanent habitats that you get in the Murray River, Cameron's Creek, and Gunbower Creek. So I guess the picture I'm really painting here is you get those really important values in the Murray River, but then those permanent habitats along Cameron's Creek as well. They're kind of the key areas in terms of biodiversity values. So it's widely recognised that habitats on the floodplain are becoming increasingly degraded in the Murray-Darling Basin system, and that's because these habitats are reliant on regular inundation to maintain good quality habitat. And that inundation has reduced as a result of inundation. And an increase in the interval between inundation events has led to a decline in the condition of the floodplain and wetland communities along the Murray River. And it's also contributed to the development of hypoxic, which is low dissolved oxygen, black water conditions across the Murray-Darling Basin. And an assessment of climate change impacts across the Murray-Darling Basin has found that the interval and frequency of those natural inundation events is likely to decrease further, hence the impetus for this project. So on to the assessment of effects. So yeah, VMFRP proposes to inundate the floodplain using infrastructure, and this includes pumps with fish and turtle exclusion devices, which prevent the uptake of fish larvae and fish individuals, as well as turtles, into these pumps. And then there's a cone fishway proposed along Cameron's Creek to bypass the Cameron's Mid-Creek regulator, and these fishways effectively work as a kind of series of steps for the fish to navigate that structure. And then there's a series of other regulators, drop structures, and associated containment banks. And these are being designed with consideration of passive fish passage through those structures. And the proposed infrastructure will provide for passive passage of aquatic fauna when fully open at most sites in most instances. And I'll touch on that a bit later when I run through the through some of the submissions. And there's improvements for passage and floodplain access in some locations where they're removing existing barriers to flow and fish passage. And then there's also a series of access tracks on the floodplain, which will have limited effect on the aquatic values. So the key findings of the specialist assessment were that for construction, the effects of the project have been assessed as insignificant or low risk with the implementation of EDS. However, the key potential adverse effects during the operation of the project are associated with the potential stranding of native fish during floodplain inundation, and then the potential for the breeding of pest fish, especially carp. And the risk related to carp is considered high for Gunbower because of those values present in Cameron's Creek, and medium risk at Guttram and Benwell. But that risk varies between the operational scenarios. And I'll go into both of these effects in more detail when I'm discussing some of the submissions. Whereas some of all the other operational effects have been assessed as insignificant or low risk. And there's also a number of beneficial effects for aquatic species, including improved aquatic habitat as a result of the operation of the project. And a number of EDS have been developed to manage and mitigate potential construction and operational effects. So on to the response to submissions. I've read all the submissions and identified those that are relevant to aquatic ecology. And rather than running through these individually, I think I'll run through the themes raised in each of these submissions. So I'll go through those now. So one of the themes raised in the public submissions were potential impacts of the project on aquatic connectivity. So a lot of aquatic species are reliant on unimpeded passage to complete key life history effects. So they've got to move on. Some of them have to move onto the floodplain, for example, to breed, or just need to be able to move up and down the river to complete life history phases. And infrastructure constructed as part of the project, such as regulators and containment banks, may create barriers to movement for those species. And those barriers can be a physical barrier, like a containment bank that a species literally can't get past, or they can be more softer, I guess, in terms of flow-related barriers. So you may get flow velocities that a fish is unable to get past. And 0.3 metres a second has been identified as a kind of target flow velocity to enable passage for most fish at most times. So during construction, impacts to aquatic fauna passage are likely to be small and temporary, so relatively low risk. Whereas during operation, passage is likely to remain similar to existing conditions at most infrastructure sites. As I mentioned earlier, passage is likely to improve at a few locations, particularly along Cameron's Creek, but then also at the Dally Bend Inlet. However, during natural floods, there may be a window of flows where passage may decline at times at a few regulator structures, as outlined in the slide. And I'll just run through this conceptually, what I mean by that window. And I'll use broken axle regulator as an example. So I don't think you actually need to worry about the values on these slides. I'm just kind of showing this conceptually. So this is what flows are doing at Broken Axle Creek Regulator, which is indicated by the little white box. It's a bit hard to see on the screen, sorry. At a Murray River flow of about 33,000 megalitres a day. And you can see here that flows are constrained to the channel, and the only ways for fish to pass through this area is through the regulator. And at a given flow, velocities at this site may exceed the swimming capacity of some species of fish at certain flows. However, as flows increase, you get inundation much more widespread across the floodplain, and you get lots more potential passage points for fish to navigate this structure. So they can go through the structure if they're able to, around the structure, but then there's opportunities to go around it on the floodplain as well. And then finally, this is a much more close-up view of a regulator structure, which is indicated by the black line on this map. So this is a much smaller scale and a fine scale, with the different colours indicating different velocities. You can see that flow is not uniform through the structures. You have areas of faster flow in the centre of the structure and areas of lower flow on the periphery of the structure. So fish might be able to navigate through those lower flow areas on the edge.
What do those arrows mean?
That's where potentially you could get fish passage, where you've got areas of lower flow.
And that's got a green colouring, and on the left-hand side, green's what? Does that put it 0.33 to 0.44 or something?
Yeah, 0.33 to 0.44. So close to that 0.3, whereas through the middle it's up around 0.5 or 0.6.
I think you've said on the slide, but what's the significance of the 0.3?
That's kind of an accepted value where most fish will be able to pass through the regulator, but fish vary in their swimming capacity depending on how big they are, what species they are. So it's a kind of catch-all number rather than a specific number.
Thank you.
And there is potential for increased fragmentation of terrestrial habitat for turtle movement and nesting. However, this was considered unlikely and a low risk at a kind of meaningful impact for turtles. So overall, the potential effects on connectivity will be minimised further through detailed design when they can bring together the design and the modelling outputs to minimise those flow effects. And then overall, the residual effect is considered low. On to the next theme, which is the stranding of native fish on the floodplain. So fish can get stranded on the floodplain through sudden changes in water level or creation of new barriers. And it's acknowledged that stranding is a natural process. It's one of the benefits of floodplain inundation is you get a lot of food on the floodplain for things like birds and stuff that eat fish. However, you want a portion of the fish to be able to return to permanent habitats after floodplain inundation. And native fish have developed a suite of cues that they use to move off the floodplain as floodwaters begin to recede.
Can you explain that a bit more? What do you mean, like the native fish and the cues?
Well, no one actually knows specifically what the cues are, but they respond to changes in water level, potentially changes to the chemistry in the water, and they know as those water levels decline that they need to move back to those permanent habitats. So in a natural inundation, those cues are present. However, in a managed inundation, those cues the appropriate cues may not be provided, which could result in a higher proportion of fish being stranded on the floodplain.
I did have another question too. You focus on native fish, but is there a difference between native fish and exotic fish in terms of responding to cues?
Yeah, you've beaten me to it. So native fish respond to those cues. You know, they've adapted over millions of years to respond to those cues, whereas pest fish have been here for much less time, 100 years or so for some of them. So they don't respond in the same way to those cues. So they tend to get stranded on the floodplain in much higher numbers, or they just respond differently. Stranding of native fish is only relevant for scenarios where there is connection between permanent habitats and the floodplain. So that's for Upper Gunbower, where you have connection to Cameron's Creek. During hybrid events, where you're going to have a natural inundation event, which is then captured and topped up, where you might get fish accessing the floodplain, and then potentially during pumped events when the river's high enough for fish to move upstream onto the floodplain through drop structures and the like. So to address this risk, a native fish exit strategy will be developed and tested under EDS SW2, and this native fish exit strategy provides cues for native fish to exit the floodplain, and then if it's well executed, it also strands the pest fish on the floodplain. So you're getting two benefits out of the native fish exit strategy. And the way this is done, I should say native fish exit strategies have been successfully implemented at Gunbower and Hatter Living Murray programs. And the way they do those is by manipulating flows onto the floodplain and drawing down the water level slowly, and that provides cues for fish to move off the floodplain. However, it's acknowledged that each site is different, the infrastructure for those sites are different, so there's a level of uncertainty in the native fish exit strategy, which results in a medium residual risk. Onto the proliferation of pest plants and animals, especially common carp. So I'll just touch on aquatic plants and foxes quickly. So pest aquatic plants can impact aquatic habitat values. However, with standard weed controls and management and monitoring, the risk is considered low for aquatic plants. And the risk is similar. There's no additional mechanism for the introduction of aquatic plants and proliferation of aquatic plants during operation compared to a natural inundation event. Foxes can impact turtles, and their impacts primarily through predating on turtle nests, but they can also predate on turtles as they travel overland to nest or navigate around structures. Construction can increase the local population by providing food waste, and operation may increase food availability through the provision of dead carp on the floodplain, for example, increased water birds, increased rabbits. However, with EDS in place, again, the risks for foxes are considered low. Now, onto pest fish. So pest fish can impact aquatic values directly. By that I mean either eating or competing with native fish, or indirectly via habitat modification. And the impacts related to carp are primarily through this second process, where they are known to impact habitat values of aquatic species. So carp are a ubiquitous problem in the Murray-Darling Basin. They are the most abundant large fish on Gunbower Island in terms of abundance and biomass. However, for this project, it's important to note that they're in unexpectedly low abundance in Cameron's Creek. And inundation of the floodplain via natural inundation or managed inundation provides a large area of breeding habitat for carp. And that's, as I said, for natural and managed inundation events. So for managed inundation events as part of the project, if carp are able to access the floodplain, breed and return to permanent habitats, it may lead to increases in the local broader carp population. Again, much like native fish stranding, the risk for pest fish only applies to specific operational scenarios where those fish are actually able to get onto the floodplain. So impacts to carp will be minimised under EDS SW2 by considering seasonal conditions when inundating the floodplain. So that's undertaking inundations commencing in winter or spring to avoid kind of key carp breeding periods. And then, as discussed earlier, the implementation of a native fish exit strategy to strand any carp that do manage to get onto the floodplain and breed on the floodplain. And then under EDS E3, there's additional carp management scenarios and strategies. And those are kind of more drastic interventions, such as actually going out and catching carp in, say, Black Charlie Lagoon to reduce the population, or draining wetlands in extreme scenarios where you get really problematic carp populations. So for carp, while the risks vary with operational scenario, the overall residual risk for gunbower is considered high due to those high quality values in Cameron's Creek, and medium in Guttram and Benwell. It's important to note that in addition to the EDS, there's monitoring as outlined in the Environmental Management Framework and adaptive management to help recognise and address these risks where they occur. And it's really important to note that, you know, carp are, as I've said, an ubiquitous and intractable problem in the Murray-Darling Basin. So the benefits to native fish from floodplain inundation, be it natural or managed, occur alongside those potential drawbacks related to carp. The next theme were concerns around impacts to water quality, and I'll really focus on dissolved oxygen for this because that's the most important one for fish. Now, I think we heard from Dr. Treadwell about this on Monday, but with the inundation of the floodplain, dissolved oxygen levels can rapidly decline as organic matter on the floodplain is decomposed, and this can create hypoxic conditions. And in terms of aquatic fauna, any dissolved oxygen below about 2 milligrams a litre is considered potentially lethal for aquatic fauna. So you can see on the right-hand side, I've got a couple of maps from the modelling undertaken by DHI with red and orange colours indicating water below that 2 milligrams a litre, and yellows and blues above that level. So you can see each of these figures is a kind of time step through the inundation event, and you can see that early on in the top couple of rows you've got widespread areas of low DO water, but then as the inundation event continues you get well oxygenated water occurring across the floodplain. And then I'll just show you the outputs for Cameron's Creek as well. You can see, cursor there, Cameron's Creek and Black Charlie Lagoon. Throughout, modelling runs are supporting well oxygenated water, which is really good because you want to maintain those high quality habitats and maintain the water quality in them. But then Bagot Swamp quickly declines to low dissolved oxygen before slowly recovering over the inundation event. So the implementation of SW2 and SW3 will reduce the risks associated with low DO. But I think importantly, the areas where you're getting that really low DO are almost always going to be filled and dry, so there won't be any aquatic values in those areas. So sudden declines in DO are not a risk to aquatic ecology values. and then the risk to the Murray River and the aquatic ecology values in the Murray River are low, as the low DO water returning to the Murray River will quickly be mixed with the well oxygenated water that's in the Murray River.
10 slides to go. McMillan, you comfortable for?
Yeah, it's fine.
Leave it again,
Goes a
mate.
bit over. Yeah.
I think these ones are a bit quicker. We've gone through the meatier issues now. And then two other water quality values were raised as concerns, and they related to salinity and turbidity. As we heard from Dr. Hoxley on Monday, there's limited effect of the project on salinity. So the adverse effects to aquatic ecology are considered insignificant. And as we heard from Dr. Treadwell, any increases in turbidity with the implementation of EDS related to construction and operation are likely to be similar to background levels. So the residual effect biodiversity is considered low. There were a number of submissions that raised concerns about impacts on the Camerons Creek system. As I've outlined already, the Camerons Creek system is where you get some really high quality aquatic habitat and those threatened species that have been reintroduced into the system. And as I mentioned, the Camerons Creek system supports unexpectedly low numbers of carp. And there isn't really a compelling argument as to exactly why that is. There's a number of hypotheses, but nothing that really indicates a good reason why those carp numbers don't explode after a floodplain inundation event. And you do get a small increase in carp numbers often after an inundation event, but then they decline over the following years. So the operation of the project, due to the more regular inundation of the floodplain, may lead to increases in pest fish abundance. However, impacts to carp will be managed through EDS SW2 and E3, as I discussed earlier. However, with these EDS in place, there's still potential for a high residual risk to aquatic values in Camerons Creek. As I mentioned earlier, through inundation, you do get increases in carp population, but you also get benefits to native fish, and those benefits to native fish are the same for managed and natural inundation as are the risks related to carp. So specific benefits from the project in Camerons Creek include improved passage, watering regimes specifically managed for aquatic values, and then increased drought resilience in the system as well. And monitoring will assess whether populations of native and pest fish are responding to the inundation, the managed inundation events, and that will be used to inform adaptive management as required. There were concerns raised around Hall Road Lagoon, which is actually outside the project area. So Hall Road Lagoon is connected to the Camerons Creek system. Those connections will remain and will be unimpacted. And as it does currently, Hall Road Lagoon will fluctuate with the water levels in Camerons Creek, which are determined upstream of the Camerons Mid-Creek regulator, and those water levels are determined by water in the Murray River in the Turrumbary Weir Pool. There are concerns that there won't be flows continuing into Camerons Creek. However, to maintain the function of the fishway, there will be almost constant trickle flows into Camerons Creek, so that fishway is maintained. So that will maintain water quality in the Camerons Creek system. There is a bit of uncertainty in the hydraulic model related to the digital elevation model, and that's due to the fact that Camerons Creek's got a lot of aquatic vegetation, which means the LiDAR is unable to collect, or the reliability of the LiDAR data is a bit less accurate, or maybe a bit less accurate. So there's a few areas along the creek. I've just got a couple of indicative areas where the MIE and areas that are regularly inundated don't necessarily align. However, the operation of the project doesn't actually intend to change where water flows on the project area. So these areas will continue to be inundated if they are inundated, and inconsistencies between the MIE and actual managed inundation extents would be addressed in the post-assessment pre-approval phase or in accordance with the environmental management framework. And if the MIE is updated, I'd recommend that the DO modelling should be updated to reflect that. There are concerns that pumping does not deliver the environmental equivalent of natural floods. So semi-permanent wetland and forest floodplain watering scenarios in Middle Gunbower and Gutterer and Benwell will be delivered by pumping. And as I mentioned, those pumps will be fitted with fish exclusion devices. So fish won't end up on the floodplain during those pumped events. However, if river levels are high enough, fish may still be able to access the floodplain structures when maintaining flow through. As such, the benefits from pumped watering events may not be the equivalent to natural floods because you won't be getting those fish on the floodplain, and then possibly you won't be getting the same benefits to, say, water birds that eat fish, such as cormorants. As such, those benefits from pumped events may not be equivalent to natural floods. However, you still get those benefits that you get to fish habitat from increased watering, where you get more aquatic vegetation, more able to respond when the floodplain is inundated. And then the other effect of these pumped events is any benefits are really localised to the areas that you inundated, rather than a natural flood where you get inundation across the floodplain much more widespread. One submission was questioning the presence of a fish management plan for the project. So a fish management plan was written for the Upper Gunbower portion of the project. It was written by Ivor Stewart at the Arthur Rylah Institute for Environmental Research, and that fish management plan was incorporated into the design and management of Upper Gunbower. And the management of carp outlined in the fish management plan will be incorporated into the pest, plant and animal monitoring and management plan. And then finally, there were a concern raised around the impacts of light pollution on wildlife. There will be no permanent lighting installed during construction and operation. However, there may be some temporary lighting required for occasional construction at night. Light escape and light spill would be managed through EDS LV3, and as such, the significance of residual effect is considered low. EDS. So we developed a number of EDS relevant to aquatic ecology around fauna management, minimising impact for design and construction and operation. And then there's also a number of aquatic ecology specific monitoring requirements outlined in the EMF table 16.3. And then in addition, there's a whole suite of further EDS developed by other specialists that also address some of the aquatic ecology risks. And these EDS are appropriate and will ensure that the environmental effects of the projects relevant to my area of expertise will be suitably managed. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Lefebvre.
Thank you. No problem.
Can I just ask a quick question before we go to the other questions? The EDS, you've referred to the exhibited version.
Yep.
Have you seen the day one version and were there any changes for
There-
your?
No changes relevant to me.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, Mr. Schinkel, you can go ahead with your questions. Thank you.
Were you involved in the production of document number 20, which is technical note number 2, the Hatter Lakes North Floodplain Restoration Project case study?
No, I was not.
Are you familiar with that document?
No, no, I'm not.
Yeah, not really. Okay. Can you open up your expert witness statement, number 37, document 37, and go to page 4 if you would, and the last 2 sentences which start from line 6 at the bottom of the page up.
Just give me a second to
That's right.
open the expert witness statement.
Just repeat that page
Yeah,
number again.
page 4, please.
Thank you.
And if you start reading 6 lines up from the last line on that page, the sentence starts, the strategy has.
Last paragraph.
The last paragraph.
In the last paragraph here, the second to last sentence is what I'll be referring to. All there?
Yep.
Okay. It reads, and you're referring, I think, to a fish management strategy.
Fish exit strategy, yep.
It says, the strategy has been effectively utilised in the Murray-Darling system, e.g. Gunbower and Hatter TLM system, but not at Gunbower or Guttram and Benwell projects where the proposed infrastructure and local environment are different.
Yep.
Now, you said you haven't seen document 20,
Yep.
but you say, just to confirm that you believe what's going on at Hatter, the subject of document 20,
Yep.
is different to the subject land we're dealing with now. Is that the case?
Yep.
So 2 different scenarios.
In related to fish, yes, they're different. The Hatter TLM and what's proposed at Gunbower.
Thanks very much. That's it.
Thanks, Mr. Schinkel.
I actually had a question that follows on, which I already had written down, but just on the native fish exit strategy, I'm just interested, and I think you said it's SW2.
Yep.
Interested actually how that works. Like, how do you implement that?
So in those graphs I showed of water levels and flows, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. So one's decreasing the flows for a period, slowly ramping down over a day or 2, then holding them steady, then increasing flows, then dropping them down again, and doing that 2 or 3 times. And from my recollection, the native fish exit strategy at Gunbower, you get a really big response to that first initial drop and then diminishing returns for the subsequent drops. And then another alternative way to do it is to have just a drop and then a hold steady and then drop it further again. And yeah, as I said, in particular at Gunbower TLM, you get a strong response of the native fish to those early declines in flow. And then you implement something similar in the project area by manipulating the infrastructure and the pumping rates, for example. And then there would be the monitoring to see what's on the floodplain and what's leaving the floodplain.
Just one further question for myself. If I understand your evidence and the presentation and the detail in the environment report, is it fair to say that the project will have an overall benefit to native fish, various species, in different ways, because of the water regime proposed, but as a consequence, the pest fish like carp may also benefit? Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary. And you get that for managed inundation, or natural inundation. Unfortunately, yeah, as I mentioned, carp are a ubiquitous and intractable problem at the moment in the Murray-Darling Basin. So, yeah, you're particularly with a managed inundation event, you've got some levers you can pull to hopefully manage those carp effectively. So, yeah, the project should overall result in benefit. However, there may be effects to carp as well.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I've just got one question. On Monday, we heard from Dr. Treadwell, and he said that the fact that water appears black does not necessarily mean that it's low oxygen. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, you can have just dark water that's not necessarily low DO.
And so the native fish species would still survive in that darker water?
Yeah. So when we were on site, we actually caught some fish. There was an area where the water was very, very black, but there was still, I think it was actually only native fish that we found in that one particular spot. And the DO, it was low, but it wasn't at that kind of lethal level.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
I just wanted to clarify, and this is something that came up yesterday, but you just referred a couple of times in your presentation to natural floods.
Yep.
When you say that, you mean what happens, obviously, in the context that there's regulation in the system.
Yeah.
So when it overtops the bank type scenario.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's fine. That's all the questions from the committee. Was there any re-examination?
No, thank you, Mr. Lefevre, be excused.
Yes, no problem. Okay. I'll just have a break now and just let Ms. Jelly set up. And we'll just maybe have we'll say it's a 16-minute break, so we'll come back at 10 past 11, and then we'll hear from her as well.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for getting set up. All right, Mr. Who's leading this?
I will be.
Mr.
I will be.
Forrester.
Thank
you.
So, Ms. Jelly, you've heard this morning, we'll skip the formal introductions, but just to confirm, you, as the discipline lead for Flora, were involved in the preparation of Specialist Assessment B on the Flora side, and you've produced an expert witness statement, which is document 39, and a presentation, document 66. Is that right? In your presentation, I think in one of the later slides, you identify one correction that needs to be made to the specialist assessment. Apart from that, are there any other corrections or matters you need to add or take away from any of those documents?
No.
So you adopt those as your evidence. Thank you. I'll hand over to you and you can share with us your presentation and take the committee through what you've done. I'll note Member McMillan, Ms. Jelly's got a fair bit to talk to.
Yes.
And so she's got the 30-minute in mind, but there's a real risk we might extend those.
Yeah, I think we've got enough time today. Obviously, we don't want to take 2 hours, but if it goes a little bit over, that's no problem.
Thank you.
Just a few minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Jelly.
Sorry, it's just taking a moment.
No,
to
the
come up
internet can be a bit.
the right way.
Mr. Forrester, it's obviously not showing up on the screen.
Oh, it's
Is
not, I'm
someone
sorry.
else able to like?
I'm able to share it from the PDF.
Yeah.
Will that
Um,
the same?
yeah, that should look the same.
Thanks. Just for the people online, we've got a few.
Yes, it's showing. showing up on
Yeah, it's showing up on this one as well. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hold on, I'll just check with
See
our.
if mine shares while Mr. O'Farrell's doing it.
Oh, there it is. It's in a weird format. I'll send a message and see if someone can sort that out, but we've got the presentation in front of us and that's up on the screen. I think everyone else will be able to see, so that's fine.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No worries.
That's fine.
All right. Very good. Right. My name is Zoe Jelly and I'm the Terrestrial Flora Discipline Lead for VMFRP. And as the discipline lead, I provided advice on the scope of the assessments, the methods for the field surveys, the data analysis, interpretation and reporting. And I took on the role of the Flora lead for the ER East package in 2024 and have undertaken Flora surveys that led to reporting updates and the interpretation of the new hydraulic modelling to look at the responsive vegetation to the proposed managed inundation at the sites. The work I'm presenting here today, though, is the culmination of thousands of hours of work that have been undertaken by R8 Flora specialists, and the key contributors have been listed in my expert witness statement. We kick on to the next slide after this. So I'm going to start by providing an overview of the work that's been undertaken for terrestrial flora at Gumbower and Guttram and Benwell as part of the specialist assessment to address the scoping requirements that are listed here. And then I'll provide a summary of our key findings before moving on to responses to the key submissions as they relate to terrestrial flora. I'll be referring to these project description terms throughout the presentation. They're defined in the specialist assessment and I can provide clarity on any of these during the presentation as required. So this next slide provides a high-level overview of the approach to undertaking the existing conditions at each site, and the methods for each of these are laid out in detail in section 3 of our specialist assessment. So in the interest of time, I won't labour over those methods, but I'll briefly outline the purpose of our assessments across both the area of investigation and the modelled inundation extent. Go to the next slide. So our field surveys across the area of investigation were undertaken between 2014 and 2024 across a range of seasons and under varying climatic conditions. The aim was to collect a detailed inventory of potential ecological values to aid design refinements to avoid and minimise impacts to ecological values, to aid EDS development, and then also to quantify any residual effects. And then the surveys across the modelled inundation extent were also undertaken over that same 10-year window, and the approach to the assessment was to describe the current condition of and ecological function of the floodplain ecosystems, and then to collect data to allow us to evaluate the response of native vegetation and threatened species to the proposed inundation. Now, to assess the response of native vegetation to inundation, we had to look at the vegetation communities present across the modelled inundation extent at each site. And this example here is for Gumbower. There are 11 ecological vegetation classes, or EVCs, across the MIE, and each of those EVCs has its own requirements for inundation in terms of depth, duration and frequency. Where these requirements overlap, they can be grouped into vegetation water requirement groups, which is a project-specific term for ecological water regime classes, or EWRCs. Now, on Wednesday last week, Mr. Honeybun outlined how the CMA develops their environmental watering proposals and how they design water delivery to meet the water requirements of the vegetation on the ground. And the same approach has been used here to design the operating scenarios for the project, looking at the different vegetation types across the floodplain and designing the water delivery to meet those various requirements. Now, as you've heard throughout the hearing already, there's a range of operating scenarios that have been designed to inundate different parts of the model inundation extent at different depths and at different lengths of time and not all at once. So to assess the response of vegetation to the inundation, we've had to look at different operating scenarios to pull together that response across the floodplains. And you can see here in this example that the red gum dominated communities that sit lower on the floodplains have greater water requirements than the box communities that sit higher on the floodplains. And whilst those box-dominated communities, they don't need water as frequently or at the same depths or for as long as Red Gun, they still need to be getting inundated in up to 3 years in 10 to maintain reliable recruitment and regeneration of canopy trees, as opposed to just survival and maintenance. So this next slide, we can see the map that shows the vegetation water requirement group mapping across the Gumbower modelled inundation extent, where each of those 11 EVCs have been grouped with vegetation types with similar water requirements. So all of the areas mapped in green are various red gum forest and woodland communities that sit within that lower to mid landscape component of the floodplain. The optimal watering requirements for these areas range from inundation in either 6 to 8 years in 10 or 3 years in 10, depending on whether they sit on the fringing wetland and waterways or if they sit slightly higher on the floodplain. Then the areas that you can see in orange, and there's some tiny areas of pink that are hard to pick out, are the box-dominated communities that we'd expect to receive water in up to 3 years in 10. So our assessment overlays the EVC mapping, the vegetation water requirement group mapping with the modelled data of all the operating scenarios, and then predicts the response of vegetation across the whole inundation extent. Now, when we're looking at individual species to determine the predicted response of threatened species that are known or predicted to occur within the modelled inundation extent, each threatened species was assigned to a plant functional group, or PFG. Starting, and this table here shows examples of the types of plants that sit in those different functional groups, with the aquatic species on the top left, moving through to the various types of floodplain flora, down to the terrestrial dry species on the right. And so again, we use the proposed operating scenarios to look at what species are on the ground, look at the depth, duration and frequency of inundation, and look at how they would all respond to the proposed inundation. And Appendix V in our specialist assessment details the predicted effects for threatened species and communities that are known or predicted to occur as a result of both construction and operation. So I'll now move on to our key findings. In terms of the existing ecological conditions at the site, the existing threats and management, as well as the residual effects predicted as a result of both the construction and operation phase of the project. The current condition of vegetation at all the sites reflects an altered hydrology state. We're seeing widespread terrestrialisation of flood-dependent vegetation. So what that means is we see a shift in the vegetation communities, particularly in the understory, away from flood-tolerant and flood-dependent understory species towards species that are more typical of drier conditions. The recruitment of canopy species is uneven across the floodplains, and in some areas it's insufficient to replace canopy over time. So in saying this, there are still a lot of ecological values at these sites: threatened species, native vegetation, Ramsar wetland components, and where these values intersect with the construction footprint, there will be localised and direct and indirect impacts, and I'll talk more on those later. As a result of the operation, we expect to see improvements in vegetation condition, diversity of flood-dependent flora species, tree canopy condition and eucalypt recruitment, improved habitat for threatened species and communities, increased drought resilience across the floodplains, as well as improvements in broader ecosystem function across the floodplains. So there are a number of existing threats. So in addition to river regulation and altered hydrology, the other key threats contributing to ecological condition at the sites also includes drought, climate change, weeds and pest species. In terms of the current management, environmental watering has been occurring at parts of Gumbower now under the Living Murray program since 2005, so we now have over 20 years of monitoring data for the site. Again, Mr Honeybun from the CMA described to the panel last week how this data is used through adaptive management to refine watering plans and management of the site. In addition to the TLM monitoring, for the last 5 years, there's been VMFRP pre-intervention monitoring undertaken at Gumbower and Guttram and Benwell in areas proposed to receive environmental water as part of the project. So we also needed to consider threatening processes relevant to the project as part of our assessment. These are processes that are listed under the EPBC or FFG Acts, and they're known or have the potential to threaten the survival, abundance or evolutionary development of a native species or ecological community. So the threatening processes listed here, they're not unique to these projects. They're processes that occur on floodplain environments. but our assessment takes into consideration where they may already occur or where they may be exacerbated during either construction or operation of the project. And the potential impacts associated with these processes would be mitigated by the implementation of the project EDSs, which set out measures to avoid, minimise and manage risks associated with these processes to the project. Now we'll have a step through. So Gumbower, so as we've heard, Gumbower contains a diverse mosaic of vegetation communities, with wetlands and river red gum communities occupying those lower parts of the floodplain, those higher elevations. This slide summarises the listed species and communities considered in the special assessment, which have informed my conclusions regarding the likely effects of the Gumbower project. Now, this next slide shows depicting some of the diverse habitats and flora species present at Gumbower. On the left, there's an example of the grey box woodland community sitting in a slightly elevated position. Then moving along the top, there's some black box woodland with some sparse lignum in the understory, but there's not a lot of other vegetation there. And then the two other landscape photos in the middle are with those larger trees are examples of some of the river red gum communities, the top one along the Murray River and the bottom of fringing a wetland area. The three photos on the right are examples of some of the threatened flora species that have been identified in the area of investigation. The first one is Myopora montanum, or waterbush, which is actually a terrestrial dry species that sits higher up on the floodplain. Then Minerea integerrima, smooth Minerea, which is a mudflat flora species that responds to inundation. And then at the bottom, the Longaryngium is a moisture-dependent flora species as well. Now, these next photos were all taken across the modelled inundation extent prior to the 2022-23 large natural floods. And the two photos on the left were taken at Pig Swamp, a wetland at Gumbower that pre-river regulation would have filled through natural flow events 50,000 megalitres a day, which means that Pig Swamp would have filled 52 out of 100 years. Under the current regulated conditions, these flow events now occur at half of that natural frequency. And so the photos here show a 4-year dry spell, and you can see the change in the top photo and the bottom photo over that window with the decline in the extent and condition of vegetation across the swamp. The photo in the middle is an example of that black box woodland occupying the upper part of the floodplain with a sparse cover of understory species and high cover of litter, which can be one indicator of reduced natural inundation. And then the two photos on the right are some examples of the river red gum creeks and flood runners that under the current conditions are only being engaged during high flow events, not annually as they would have been prior to river regulation. And so we can see here the low cover of understory species along those waterways. This next slide summarises the results from the rapid condition assessment sites that were established across the Gumbower modelled inundation extent. And these sites were used to collect additional information on vegetation conditions such as terrestrialisation and then evidence of eucalypt recruitment. In the specialist assessment, we've identified recruitment as being where there was at least one juvenile canopy species within a 50-metre radius of the survey point. So as the table shows, there was some level of recruitment recorded at 34 of the sites, while 25 sites showed evidence of terrestrialisation, highlighting that mixed condition of vegetation across the floodplain. And the mapping on the next slide shows the condition of vegetation across the modelled inundation extent. And the sliding colour scale on the right was developed using the results of both VQA and the rapid site assessment data. And we can see that the vegetation condition varies across the modelled inundation extent, and the areas of the higher condition shown in those bright and dark green colours are generally associated with parts of the floodplain that are currently receiving more regular inundation from natural flows, while the areas of lower condition are on higher elevation parts of the floodplain and they're currently receiving less frequent inundation, and the flood duration is also shorter in these areas under the natural inundation. So these next slides Mr. Lefever's already showed some comparisons, so I'll move through these quickly, but they show some examples of vegetation condition within the Gumbow modelled inundation extent. And for all of these comparison slides, the photos on the left were taken in 2021 and the photos on the right were taken at the same location in 2024, so after that large natural flood event. They illustrate some of the different responses expected in flood-dependent vegetation communities in response to inundation, including increased understory cover and the re-establishment of wetland-dependent species following inundation. On this next slide, we can see the lignum swampy woodland has showed a strong understory response following inundation, whereas the drier plains woodland community exhibited a more subdued response to the large floods, with vegetation structure remaining broadly similar, although in the plains woodland example, there also appears to be a reduction in the accumulated leaf litter following inundation as well. Moving on to Guttram and Benwell, this site also supports a diverse range of floodplain habitats, and it's dominated by wetlands and river red gum communities that depend on periodic flooding to maintain their condition and ecological function. Again, this slide summarises the listed flora species identified at Guttram and Benwell that again inform my conclusions regarding the likely effects of the project. So these photos show some of the different river red gum habitats in the area of investigation at Guttram and Benwell. The photo on the top left was taken prior to the 2022-23 floods, while the other landscape photos were taken the year after the floods, and they show how the understory has responded with an increase in the cover of native vegetation and forbs, as well as the establishment of recruitment. You can also see two of the threatened species that have been recorded on higher parts of the floodplain, branching groundsel and pale flax lily. Now, both of these species are moisture dependent and they fit into the terrestrial damp PFG from that earlier slide. Now, these photos were all taken within the modelled inundation extent at Guttram and Benwell, and the three photos along the top show reed bed swamp. The first photo was taken in winter in 2021, and then the next two photos show the same site following delivery of environmental water and natural inundation in spring and summer of that year. So we can see here the shift in vegetation from mudflat flora species on the left through to the emergent and amphibious species within months after the delivery of water. On the bottom, we've got some examples of the classic river red gum forest floodplain at Guttram and Benwell before and after a natural flooding event. And then on the right, there are two of the key listed threatened species at this site, Amphibromus fluitans, the grass in the background, which is EPBC listed, and then wavy marshwort in the foreground there. So both of those species obviously thriving there in response to inundation. This table summarises the results of the rapid condition assessments at Guttram and Benwell. So compared to Gumbower, the results for Guttram and Benwell show a stronger terrestrialisation signal, reinforcing the evidence of declining floodplain condition associated with reduced inundation frequency and duration. Now, similar to Gumbower, vegetation condition varies across the floodplain and is closely related to inundation history. So areas that receive more frequent inundation generally exhibit that higher condition, and we can see the difference here with Benwell to the northwest, with those brighter green areas where there's higher condition and the floodplain has greater hydrological connectivity, while the areas with reduced connectivity further south show greater evidence of terrestrialisation and declining condition. And again, these sets of pre and post 22-23 flood images show some of the varying responses of the red gum communities across the floodplain. And the next slide shows some examples of one of the other EBC's floodway pond herbland in various stages following that same 22-23 natural flood again. So together, all of these examples help demonstrate that the responses vary across the floodplain ecosystems according to the EBC, the water requirements of the EBCs, how frequently the location is inundated and for how long, the position on the floodplain and hydrological connectivity as well. Now I'll quickly step through the residual effects outlined in our assessment. So the residual effects outlined in the specialist assessment are the result of an extensive amount of work that's been undertaken since the business case phase to design the Gumbower and Guttram Benwell projects in a way that avoids and minimises impacts to ecological values. And a key component of this process was a series of alternatives workshops where specialists across disciplines, including ecology and heritage, met with the VMFRP team along with traditional owners and other stakeholders such as Parks Vic, DECA, North Central CMA, etc., to review and refine the construction footprints. And these workshops drew on detailed field survey data collected over a number of years to identify ecological constraints and to inform design changes. During the workshops, the construction footprints were progressively reviewed and refined across both sites. And some of the key outcomes of the workshops that are reflected in the current design include things like reducing the amount of road widening that was proposed, shifting the location of turning circles to avoid and minimise impacts to large trees or threatened species, reducing the overall number of turning circles that were included as part of the original design, and then incorporating no-go zones around infrastructure and laydown areas where there might be large trees or threatened species or communities. So there have been multiple rounds of design refinement that have led to significant reductions in the proposed impacts compared with the referral stage, including the avoidance to impacts to hundreds of large trees, as well as substantial areas of native vegetation. Consistent with EDS E1, the refinement process would continue as the project progresses, with further opportunities to minimise impacts to native vegetation and habitat to be considered during the detailed design and construction phase. Now, Hatter Lakes North, as the most advanced of the VMFRP sites, provides a practical example of how the avoid and minimise process can continue beyond the assessment stage. As part of the post-approval detailed design and construction planning, approximately 5.5 hectares of native vegetation and 116 large trees that were retained during construction compared to the impacts assessed during the EES phase. So I'm not suggesting that the same reductions will necessarily occur at Gumbower and Gutchman Benwell. Rather, this example demonstrates that further reductions in impact can be achieved during the detailed design and construction phase of the project. Now, this graph on the left summarises the predicted response of the native vegetation at Gumbower to the proposed managed inundation. So it's the result of those detailed assessments, reviewing the operating scenarios, vegetation on the ground and the water requirement groups of the various EVCs to determine a primary predicted response. The key finding is that the majority of the vegetation is predicted to exhibit a positive or positive neutral response to managed inundation over the 500 hectares of floodplain. We've also predicted benefits to over 5,000 large trees across the modelled inundation extent, and this is in contrast to those 604 large trees considered a loss. Only a small area, approximately 2.5 hectares, is conservatively predicted to exhibit a negative response, which I'll discuss later in response to the submissions. And the figure on the right is taken from the groundwater specialist assessment, and it was also adopted in our assessment. And it's a map showing the areas that Dr. Hoxley described on Monday, where we'd expect to see an increase in evapotranspiration. On the map, the modelled inundation extent it's a bit hard to see the fluoro green band down the middle, and then those paler green areas across the background show the extent of where there'd expect to be an increase in evapotranspiration, and in those areas we'd expect to see an increase in the growth and condition of canopy trees. So whilst our assessments and the AOIB restrict any quantitative assessment of benefits to the areas within the modelled inundation extent on public land, there are other benefits associated with the project that sit outside those footprints.
And Ms. Jolly, on your review of the updated groundwater modelling and that technical memorandum, has your opinion in terms of the effect of or influence of evapotranspiration changed in any material way?
No.
Thanks.
So this next slide is focused on the residual effects of operation on the EPBC Act listed threatened ecological community, grey box grassy woodlands and derived native grasslands of southeastern Australia at Gumbower. We'll shorten that from now on. The grey box grassy woodland TEC covers approximately 1,300 hectares of the Gumbower forest. So the yellow hashed area on that map shows the extent of the grey box TEC across the project area. So this 1,300 hectare area represents 0.002% of the estimated 200,000 hectares of the Victorian distribution of this TEC. So our specialist assessment identified the potential for up to 4.25 hectares of impacts to the grey box grassy woodland TEC, and approximately half of those impacts would be indirect with 2.07 hectares of the vegetation expected to remain in situ. So the areas of grey box grassy woodland TEC within the construction footprint at Gumbower have been subject to extensive footprint refinements to further avoid and minimise the impacts to the TEC. And there's a specific EDS E2G, site-specific additional measures for Gumbower that outlines the additional requirements related to the protection of MNES at Gumbower during the construction phase of the project. So looking at that map, alongside the TEC mapping in yellow, we can see the blue hashing. So that's the project's modelled inundation extent. So from these two figures, we can see that approximately 45 hectares of the grey box TEC would be located within the modelled inundation extent. Where these overlap, we've assessed the predicted response of the grey box TEC to the managed inundation. And again, the assessment predicts a predominantly positive response to this community as a result of the project's operation, with a very small area, 0.5 hectares, assessed as having a neutral response. And there are no areas of the grey box TEC expected to have a negative response to the proposed inundation. In the context of the MNES assessment, this was an important consideration in concluding that the proposed operating regime is expected to support the ecological character and the condition of the grey box grassy woodland within the inundation area. And when considered alongside the predicted ecological benefits of managed inundation, residual impacts are not considered significant for this community. Now, this next slide here summarises the residual construction effects outlined in our assessment for Guttram and Benwell. As clarified in my expert witness statement, of the 727 large trees accounted for as impacted, 318 are expected to be direct impacts, not 371 as outlined in the specialist assessment, and 409 are considered a loss through indirect impacts and would remain in situ. Again, the Hatter Lakes North case study provides a practical example of how further avoid and minimise actions could be taken during detailed design. In this next slide, we can see, similar to Gumbower, the assessment predicts a predominantly positive and positive neutral response to the 1,100 hectares of floodplain, with no areas predicted to exhibit a negative response at Guttram and Benwell. We've also predicted benefits to over 11,500 large trees across the modelled inundation extent, again in contrast to the 727 large trees considered a loss. Again, the figure on the right shows that extensive area. We're expecting to see an increase in evapotranspiration, and we'd expect to see improvements in tree health and condition in areas, again, exceeding the project footprint. This next slide summarises my key conclusions regarding the residual effects from the specialist assessment. Importantly, in coming back to some of the reasons for the existence of VMFRP, our survey results have identified a decline in condition across a range of parameters that one needs to consider when assessing the cumulative effects of the projects. The project aims to halt or reverse some of this observed decline in ecosystem function and to improve condition at the sites. To achieve the predicted benefits across the broader floodplains, there will be localised impacts to native vegetation, large trees, threatened species and ecological communities. And these impacts have been refined over time, and the avoid and minimise impacts have been put in place and would be further refined during detailed design and construction. So based on the results of our assessment, I believe that the operation of the project is likely to result in an overall improvement in biodiversity of the floodplains at the sites, with expected improvements to the condition and extent of native vegetation and canopy cover, populations of threatened species and threatened ecological communities, and an increase in the extent and condition of floodplain wetlands and marshes. Now, North Central CMA has presented in great detail about the approach to monitoring at the sites, and the same approach would be applied and adopted for these VMFRP sites. So in the interest of time, I'll keep moving. The environmental delivery standards set out how impacts identified in the assessment are managed during design, construction and operation. I reviewed the EDS framework as part of both the specialist assessment and my expert witness statement. In my opinion, the EDSs address the terrestrial flora risks associated with the impact pathways and that were identified in the specialist assessment.
Before you move on to key submission themes, just on that, on the EDSs, can I just confirm with you that you've reviewed the day one version of the EDSs?
Yes, I have.
And what's your view in respect of the matters that you set out on this slide, having now reviewed those?
no changes to the slide or the specialist assessment.
Thank you.
I've read all of the submissions and identified 4 broad themes relating to terrestrial flora, and I'll now respond to each of those themes in turn, drawing on the findings from the specialist assessment and my expert witness statement. So submissions raised queries regarding whether the current condition of the floodplain vegetation at the sites was in ecological decline and whether environmental watering is required. So the evidence from field assessments and long-term monitoring indicates that vegetation condition is in decline and that it's not in a steady state, and its condition is likely linked to reduced flows under river regulation. Some of the indicators for this include terrestrialisation, reduced diversity of flood-dependent and flood-tolerant species in the understory, and then recruitment constraints of canopy species. Based on the results of our assessment, I believe the current condition of the floodplain does not represent a stable ecological state, and without intervention, condition is expected to continue to decline at the sites. Submissions raised concerns regarding whether managed inundation could result in overwatering, adverse vegetation change, or unintended vegetation transitions. So those risks were explicitly considered through field data collection and analysis, long-term monitoring, assessment of ecological water requirements, and then project-specific modelling. The assessment predicts predominantly positive or positive neutral vegetation responses across the modelled inundation extent at both sites, with a small localised exception at Gumbower that I'll discuss on the next slide. Overall, though, and based on the results of the assessment, in my opinion, the proposed operating scenarios for the project are ecologically appropriate and would be expected to improve the condition of native vegetation communities across the modelled inundation extent. So the specialist assessment identified one localised area that's been conservatively assessed as having a negative response to inundation. It's approximately 2.5 hectares of riverine chenopod woodland immediately downstream of the middle forest offtake regulator, and the area on the map shown with that yellow arrow. The vegetation in this area has been subject to terrestrialisation over the last approximately 80 years as a result of the reduced frequency in inundation of this part of the floodplain. As a result, the composition of the canopy trees present has slightly shifted, and the percentage of black box trees has increased, and the vegetation now contains a combination of river red gum and black box trees in the canopy. And box trees are now the dominant canopy species here. This split of black box and river red gum in the canopy has resulted in the vegetation being mapped as riverine chenopod woodland in its current state. So the optimum inundation frequency for this EVC is up to 3 years in 10. This area occurs within the flow path that would be used to deliver environmental water to downstream river red gum forests. It's predicted to experience inundation slightly more frequently than is typical for EVC 103. But what that means is we would be expecting this area to be inundated 3 years in 10 with VMFRP, and potentially up to 6 years in 10 under the basin plan with VMFRP. Which accounts for inundation as a result of high flows of the Murray River, as well as the managed inundation through VMFRP. So this would actually be a return to the frequency of inundation that would have occurred at this location prior to river regulation, and would represent a more natural flow regime for this area. So whilst the specialist assessment has conservatively assessed that the response of the 2.5 hectare area would be negative, we're not expecting to see a loss of native vegetation in the area, but we've predicted a reversal of terrestrialisation. And the vegetation composition with an increase in the flood-dependent and flood-tolerant understory species and a reduction in the cover of chenopods, with the area expected to remain dominated by native species. So this is the principal area identified as having a negative response across both sites, and it doesn't alter the overall conclusion that the predicted response across the modelled inundation extent at both sites is predominantly positive or positive neutral. There were some submissions that raised concerns regarding the extent of potential impacts to native vegetation and large trees resulting from the construction of the projects. So from the business case phase through to the current design, in the environment report, the projects were subject to multiple rounds of alternatives assessments and specialist review and design refinement, as we've discussed, to avoid and minimise impacts wherever practicable. So while some localised impacts cannot be avoided entirely, my conclusion is that they are localised to the construction footprint, they have been substantially reduced through the mitigation hierarchy, and that they would be further managed through the implementation of the project EDSs. Again, as demonstrated by the Hatter Lakes North case study, opportunities to further avoid and minimise impacts would continue through detailed design and construction planning following project approval. Now, on this next slide, the important reminder here is that the assessment of impacts is conservative and many of the large trees and native vegetation that's considered a loss will remain in situ, but I've covered this content on earlier slides. So I will move on to our last theme. So the submissions under this theme raise concerns regarding the potential impacts to listed species and ecological communities. These residual effects have been assessed together with the environmental delivery standards, the adaptive management framework, and the ecological benefits predicted from managed inundation. My conclusion, based on the specialist assessment and expert witness statement, is that while residual impacts remain, they are localised and the predicted operational response for listed species and habitat and ecological communities are predominantly positive or positive neutral. So when considered in the context of the mitigation measures that will be implemented and the broader ecological benefits predicted from managed inundation, those residual impacts are not considered significant. Now, to conclude the discussion on threatened species and ecological communities, I'll use pale flax lily as an example of how the specialist assessment assessed the potential effects of the project on an individual threatened species and reached its conclusions. So the mapping and targeted surveys undertaken for the specialist assessment identified up to 350 individuals at Gumbower and up to 250 individuals at Guttram and Benwell, with up to 85 individuals potentially being affected by the construction phase of the project. Now, in terms of the predicted response of this species to the project's operation, pale flax lily occurs within floodplain margins. It's a moisture-dependent species, it's a terrestrial damp, PFG, and whilst it's not dependent on frequent inundation, it persists in damp areas. And based on the species' habitat requirements and inundation tolerance, our assessment concluded that the response of this species at the site would be positive or neutral with no adverse effects expected as a result of managed inundation. And this is consistent with incidental observations in spring 2024 at Guttram that showed a significant increase in the population of pale flax lily in areas that were subject to much deeper and longer inundation during the 22-23 floods than would be proposed as part of the project. So pale flax lily was recorded within the modelled inundation extent of both sites, and while there's no DECA modelled population data, our assessment predicts the population of pale flax lily at the sites to be much larger and estimates for Gumbower at over 700 individuals alone. So the same approach has been taken to document the likely residual effects of both construction and operation for each EPBC or FFG listed species and community known or predicted to occur across the project areas, and that detail is all in Appendix B of our specialist assessment. And that brings me to the conclusion of my expert evidence.
Thank you, Ms. Jelly.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Shinkle, do you have any questions for Ms. Jelly?
Thanks again. Were you involved in the production of the Hatter Lakes North Floodplain Restoration Project case study?
No, I was not.
But you're pretty familiar with it?
Yes.
Now, can I take you to your document number 39, your expert witness statement? Can everybody call that up, please?
I'll probably share that on the screen if that helps.
If technically possible, yeah.
Oh, can I? Oh, it wasn't working. I can share it
I can offer
locally.
to do that too.
Which
Which page would you like? Which page would you like?
Okay, now if we can go to 5.45. The last paragraph of that section, are we there? It begins B requirements for an.
On the screen now, it's on PDF page 15.
15 of that. Everybody there?
Mr. Shinkle, it's on the screen.
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one. Starting here. Good. Okay. In it reads the requirements for an auditable construction environment management environment management plan to confirm that works are conducted appropriately. And it goes on, the CEMP would include construction requirements, monitoring and auditing requirements. Now, these two things, being auditable and auditing, what authority would you say would be best placed to undertake that auditing?
So the detail of what will be included in the CEMP will be outlined post-approval. So there's been a framework set up, but that detail hasn't yet been outlined.
So you can't say what authority you believe should undertake that auditing.
No, that sits outside of my scope.
Are you aware that as of today, the National EPA has been established?
Yes.
Would you believe that is a worthwhile authority to undertake that sort of auditing?
I'm aware that the National EPA has been established, but I'm not across the details of the works that they undertake. So.
Okay. Now, you mentioned Ramsar in lots of places. Now, going to an even higher level, would you believe that possibly the Ramsar Secretariat itself and 2 employees of DCCEEW who are on the Ramsar Secretariat for Oceania are well placed to undertake such an audit?
I'm not sure if they're the appropriate people to undertake the audit. However, we have worked with DQ, the Federal Environment Agent, as TRG members and worked with them through the process of assessing Ramsar wetlands at the site.
So you say DCCEW have been involved in your getting to this point?
Correct.
So would you say then that excludes them from any consideration as an authority to undertake any auditing? Because you can't audit something you've been involved in.
They haven't been involved in undertaking the assessments. They've provided guidance on the regulation. But so whether the appropriateness of DQ to be involved in the audit would sit outside of my remit though.
All right. Now, in your delivery, you mentioned the word monitoring.
Correct.
Can you tell me the difference between monitoring and auditing?
So monitoring, you are looking for responses to, in my case, terrestrial flora, it could be native species, it could be changing composition, it could be an increase in weeds, it could be a range of parameters that you're looking for. Whereas auditing, you would have benchmarks that you're looking for, and you would be looking to see how the progression has changed.
So the monitoring is not of the people actually doing the work. Would they require to be monitored? So they don't chop down trees that you've said shouldn't be chopped down, and you turn up one day to do your monitoring and say, well, that tree shouldn't have been chopped down. Should your monitoring go to the, and what should be the extent of your monitoring? Should you be there monitoring the people doing this work?
So the CMP, the frameworks and the environmental management frameworks have been developed. They don't go to the level of detail of who will be on site at any times, but there have been recommendations for suitably qualified ecologists to be present, especially during works in sensitive areas.
Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I
Member
just have
Elliott. Sorry.
one question, and it came through with your presentation and evidence that it seems that the assessments are quite conservative. Yeah. And so over time and through practice with your other projects in this space, the tree assessment has been reduced in terms of, can you just take me through how that might work in practice? You did have some examples there, but for this one, take us through the 10% tree protection zone reduced, because there was quite a few on site. We saw quite a few narrow tracks that we went down. So I'm just interested in how that might work in practice.
So I guess under the guidelines, any impacts to 10% of the tree protection zone, which has now been changed to traditional root zones, so TPZ or NRZ, would mean that you would deem that tree a loss through indirect impacts to the TPZ. There's also the requirement to consider the impacts to canopy extent. So if 30% of the canopy of a tree would be removed, so if that was on a narrow track with low overhanging tree branches, where those canopy needed to be trimmed or pruned by 30% or more. And again, those trees would be considered a loss if you needed to get a large vehicle through. So I guess that's one of the reasons why when looking at which tracks to utilise for the project, the aim has been to use the the main tracks through the project areas to reduce the number of tracks and not give, I guess, free rein across the large network of tracks across the sites, and to choose the tracks where the impacts would be smaller. But so yes, for some of those existing main tracks that are part of the construction footprint, so you've seen on site those examples where there are large trees immediately adjacent. So those trees will have been considered a loss whilst there's no intention or plans to directly or indirectly impact them, because the construction footprint follows those track routes. They would be considered an indirect loss. So that's where some of that conservative nature of the assessment comes in, where we, we're not expecting high traffic during operation. The construction effects are localised at points. You've done the site tour now where the regulators are, etc. So there will be more frequent traffic during the construction phase, which can lead to things like soil compaction. And again, arborist recommendations in place for how to minimise impacts, indirect impacts to trees along those tracks as well. I wasn't involved in the preparation of the technical note for Hatter Lakes, but I was involved and did the original approvals for Hatter Lakes North and Hatter South, and so I've seen, I guess, those the ability for the further reductions to be made in real time at other projects as part of VMFRP and TLM. Thank you.
Just ask a question off the back of that. You identified in your presentation, you had a couple of summary tables where it's like tree losses, and then there was some reference to hollow bearing trees. Was that just the number from the total loss?
A subset, yes, not in addition to, correct.
So
yes.
When you were talking about looking at the tracks or different, design responses, have you taken that into account, having regard to the hollow bearing tree? Like, I'm just trying to understand the percentage
yes,
of.
Yeah, so that was part of the alternatives workshop
Yeah.
as well. So looking at, we had screens up and they ran over a few sessions because there's a lot of footprint and track networks to get through, and looking at, edging tracks slightly to the, the east or the west to avoid trees, and where there were things like trees of a similar size, then looking at things such as hollows, as well as heritage values that needed to be considered alongside.
Just one clarification. Did I understand you correctly when you were saying that a high level of leaf litter indicates that the trees might not be in top condition?
No, so the high level of leaf litter can be one of the indicators of a reduced inundation. So it can build up over time when there hasn't been regular inundation across an area.
And that's because the trees get distressed and drop leaves?
Partially because they're getting distressed and dropping leaves, but also just because that natural flood movement in these landscapes shifts the build-up of leaf litter off the floodplain environments. So it's a combination.
Yeah, thank you.
Just one final question. We've talked about just the other examples, and obviously one of our terms of reference is to look at, the learnings from the other projects. Just wondering, in your involvement in the previous projects, if there's been learnings that have been integrated into the EDS or Flora, or other lessons that have sort of
part of the Hatter and Belsa, as part of the we refined EDSs as part of this process, as part of the panel process for the terrestrial flora, and those changes have then all been adopted across into the remaining 3 packages. So those changes are now all embedded into the current project and for the next ES West.
So that was from the Hatter and the Bells.
Yeah, so that was the first one going through the process.
That was all the questions from the committee. Oh, sorry, get the wrong person.
No re-examination, so if Ms. Jelly could.
All right, no, that's fine. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Much.
Okay. Might have another small break now. It looks like we'll try and finish before lunchtime if possible. So we might just come back at 1:15, just allow a little bit of time for set up. I'll get Mr. I don't know what his surname is, Rashid, to come in and just check the IT to make sure it's working. I understand there might be a bug in this room, so we might have to get someone else to screen share if that happens again. So just have a quick break now. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Just before we get started, I note that Mr. Shinkles made put a couple of questions to the witnesses about the monitoring and auditing processes. Some of those questions may not continue to ask, but it might be more appropriate to address them through submission. So just asking the proponent if you could deal with that in your main submission or closing submission, just to give an overview of how that's intended to work.
Yeah, we're a bit curious about some of these questions coming from the Friends of Koalas. When we saw their base submission, we didn't see any of this coming out of the submission that's been referred to. But we'll sit here and we'll listen to what they have to say when they come to their submissions and respond if we need to.
All right, thank you. I think it might just assist as well for us to just understand how that's going to work. All right, thank you. Who?
If that's okay.
Yep, okay.
So, Mr. Holmes, I think you've been here this morning. You've heard the practices that have been adopted. There's two documents that you've produced. One is document 33, your expert witness statement, and the second is document 65, which is a presentation, which has the front slide shown to the screen. In those two documents, is there anything you wanted to add, subtract, or correct?
No.
You adopt both of those documents as true reflections of your opinion in this matter?
Yes, I do.
Tender those two documents, please, Member McMillan. And I think you've heard what I'll call the opening summary that I gave this morning in terms of where we're up to in the hearing. So can I just pass across to you to provide a summary of your evidence by reference to your slides, please?
Thanks, Mr. O'Farrell. As Mr. O'Farrell pointed out, my name's Alex Holmes. I'm a terrestrial zoologist based up in Mildura, been there for 26 years, with GHD for 20 years, over 20 years now. I've been involved in the VMFRP project as the fauna lead now for quite some years, even pre-referral phase. I was involved at that stage as well. With the Gunbow and Guttram Benwell projects, I undertook some early investigations, some early baseline surveys back in 2017. I wasn't actually involved in the follow-up surveys that was undertaken by others. However, I did develop the survey methods that were implemented across the various packages, and I also undertook the technical assessment and review of the Specialist Assessment B. So just in terms of a bit of a summary of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk to the summary of works undertaken, talk about the key findings, talk about post-exhibition activities. I'm going to talk about the key submissions and the themes from those submissions and some of my responses. I'm also going to talk about the proposed monitoring and some of those environmental delivery standards. So that's what I'll be covering today. So in terms of a summary of work that's been undertaken, look, I'm not going to labour the scoping requirements too much. They've already been outlined by others, but I think the general approach with that is that avoid and minimise. That's the avoid, minimise, and then implement those EDSs to minimise those environmental effects. So I think the important point, which has already been raised a number of times, is that this project is different. So the overall objective is to provide environmental benefits to the floodplains. So it's not a typical development project, which we're probably used to seeing. This one is looking at the broader benefits to that overall floodplain system at both of the sites. As we're aware, there are some impacts, and some of these impacts are necessary. They are discrete and in localised areas, such as the construction of a regulator or a stop bank. So those are quite localised impacts. And when compared to the overall context of the broader floodplains, there's overall benefits that will be provided. So I guess just following on from that, it's really that broader landscape scale benefit that we're looking at. So broader landscape scale benefits to the floodplain environment. So there's obviously benefits to fauna. There's immediate benefits that will be seen to frogs and water birds. So they obviously add water to a system and they respond quite rapidly. They'll respond to that water as it's implemented in the system. And then there's longer term benefits to terrestrial fauna. So reptiles, small mammals and woodland birds. And that's more that maintenance and preservation of their woodland habitat. It's also important to note that the fauna in these systems are adapted to periodic inundation. So we had that 2022 flood, which is the largest flood experience in the region for around 70 years. And these species are adapted and they have strategies to survive that periodic inundation. So I'm just going to explain in a little bit more detail the approach and our method that we implemented for these projects, or for this particular project. So the terrestrial fauna investigations, they have extended, I guess, for quite a significant amount of time. So specifically for this specialist assessment B, we undertook desktop assessments. So we look at available literature, previous surveys that have been conducted in these areas. We look at government databases. And some of the government databases do take a little while to get updated. So we also look at other databases such as eBird, which is updated regularly. Also Atlas of Living Australia and iNaturalist. So those databases are contributed to on a regular basis and they are vetted, that information's vetted. So that way we can get really current and up-to-date information that we can input into our assessments. The site investigations, as I said before, I was involved in developing the methods for the site investigations. Those were done in consultation with government authorities. So developed and we undertook a period of consultation before we actually went into the field and undertook our surveys. So our surveys are really focused on threatened species and communities, migratory species and their habitats. So that was a real focus of our assessments. And that information was obviously used to prepare the specialist assessment B. And also really important to note that the specialist assessment B underwent a series of reviews and discussions with the government authorities as well. So it's a really rigorous process and there's a lot of consultation and stakeholder involvement in every phase. So effectively what we're looking to do is document existing conditions, including known or potential values, threatened species, threatened ecological communities and migratory species with the potential to be impacted. So we also take that to the next phase of identifying residual effects that would result from the construction and operation phases of the project. So we're looking at potential impacts to native listed species and communities. So with the fauna surveys, they were very detailed. So every fauna survey, particularly of this nature, includes a range of different techniques and approaches because we're really trying to get a picture of the full suite of faunal groups within the location. So for these surveys, we used funnel trappings. That's an effective method for small reptiles, ground dwelling reptiles. Elliott trapping is an effective method for small mammals. Remote cameras, which a lot of people would be aware of now, are very effective for detecting cryptic species that are difficult to trap or observe. We also undertook a range of timed bird surveys, so generally early in the morning or late in the evening when birds are more active. Harp trapping, which in the photo to the top right of the slide That's a photograph of a harp trap. So they're an aluminium frame trap with fishing line extended. It's a bit difficult to see in the photo. But basically, the bat flies into the fishing line and falls into the pouch at the bottom where they can be retrieved and identified. Harp traps, we also used echolocation call recording. So you can use these devices to record the ultrasonic vocalizations of bats, microbats, and then a range or several species will have quite distinct call characteristics. We can take that back later and use software to analyse and identify the various species. We also undertook a range of nocturnal surveys, call playback, which is quite a useful method for species that will call during the breeding season. But also, so grey crowned babblers, species that's known from both of the sites. They're quite a territorial species of bird that live in family groups, and they will respond to the call. They think it's a rival group of grey crowned babblers, and they'll respond, and they're easier to detect that way. And then we had a big team of zoologists on site, moving between sites. So there's a lot of incidental observations, which is not just purely restricted to threatened species, but we're recording the suite of species on site. So a range of non-threatened species as well recorded. So this next slide, just a bit of a summary of the different techniques that we used. But importantly here, down the bottom there, you'll see the range of species that we targeted for these particular investigations. And importantly, there's a series of guidelines that are put out by the federal government. And our surveys were tailored to meet the survey requirements, and that being the survey techniques that needed to be used, and also the survey effort that we needed to satisfy to be in adherence with those guidelines. So just in summary, the species we were targeting with these surveys were superb parrot, growling grass frog, Sloan's froglet, the southeastern or Corbin's long-eared bat, and the painted honeyeater. So survey methods were really designed to target those species. And just as a summary, really the focus for the fauna investigations were EPB SIAC, so that's the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, Threatened Species and Communities, EPB Act, Migratory Species, Ramsar Wetlands, threatening processes. So we're really looking to determine whether we're going to be exacerbating any of those threatening processes through the proposed project. Also pest fauna, we're interested to see what pest fauna species are present and whether there's any potential for any increase in population of pest fauna. So just delving into a little bit more detail on the various threatened species communities, either known or with the potential to occur at the two sites. As I mentioned, the southeastern or Corbin's long-eared bat. And southeastern long-eared bat's a bit of an old name for that species. Pictophilus corbini, quite a distinctive species. So a more common bat or microbat that people might be experienced with is a lesser long-eared or Gould's wattle bat. So typically in the range of 7, 8 or 9 grams for those two common species. So Corbin's long-eared bat, a large female, could be in the order of 17, 18 or 19 grams. So they're quite large as far as microbats go. So there are species that occur in around 6 or 7 discrete populations of Victoria, and they also occur in sort of central and western New South Wales and into southeastern Queensland. They're generally quite rare where they occur, and they're quite difficult to survey for, so they're not often trapped. Painted honeyeater is another species that has potential to occur. Generally quite a nomadic species. They respond to the fruiting of mistletoe, so they generally move in response to where mistletoe are fruiting. Superb parrot are known from the site as well. They're more of an incidental species that occurs in the site. They do nest. Nearest known nesting colony is in excess of 40 kilometres to the east of Gumbower. but they do occur on site. Growling grass frog, not currently known to occur at either of the sites, but it is quite a mobile species of frog known from areas outside the locality. Sloane's froglet is known, some recent records from Guttram and Benwell. Australasian bittern, also known from the sites. So no EPBC Act listed fauna communities were detected at the sites, but the Victorian temperate woodland bird community was confirmed to be present. So just in terms of key findings, I'll try and move through these sort of fairly quickly. But what we did is we did an assessment of potential responses to the various fauna groups, to the operating scenarios. So unsurprisingly, water birds would be expected to respond really strongly to the various operating scenarios. And it obviously depends on the various gills of which particular gill we're talking about under each scenario. So migratory shorebirds are obviously only going to be present during the warmer months when they move into Australia on their migratory patterns. And large waders, they're probably going to respond more when the water regimes are, sort of in a more shallow sort of state, or when there's mud flats present. We also looked at terrestrial mammals, arboreal mammals, and volant mammals, which are mammals that can fly, microbats in this particular case. And that's where we sort of talked to that broader habitat enhancement and protection into the future, which is what these projects will provide. So we're assuming that we're predicting a positive response to the various operating scenarios for those fauna groups, and obviously a strong response from water birds. Moving to the Victorian temperate woodland bird community and some of the other woodland birds and raptors, and also reptiles. Again, a positive response, but that's more when we're looking at that broader habitat maintenance and improvement into the future. Unsurprisingly, frogs will respond very rapidly to the introduction of environmental water. So we did assess a number of key effects. So we looked at the ecological risks in the construction and operation phase for native species, threatened ecological communities and their habitats, and threatened species in their habitats. And through a rigorous process, as others have already mentioned, we developed a range of environmental delivery standards. These are I'm not going to go through every single one there, but there's a whole range of different standards in relation to fauna. And with the implementation of those EDSs, we end up with a residual risk rating of between sort of low to medium, so relatively manageable residual risks for those fauna aspects. So that's Gunbow, and also very similar for Guttram and Benwell. So same sort of risk assessment that we undertook, and very, very similar results. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. It probably distills that information a little bit more easy to understand sort of format. So those residual impacts during the construction phase, as I mentioned before, there will be some discrete areas where there will be a permanent loss of small areas of habitat. And so that'll affect not just threatened species, but all species. So we're going to have some little discrete areas where we'll have some habitat loss. We've mentioned the large old trees, so those hollow-bearing trees. We will lose some small areas of hollow-bearing trees. That could have an impact on species like lace monitor and carpet python. There'll be some disturbance during construction. So there'll be dust, noise and lighting impacts. That's going to impact on all species. And then there's also potential for roadkill during construction. There'll be more vehicular movements through those areas during construction. Fauna groups probably at most risk could be reptiles, are a bit slower to get out of the way. So they could be at risk during the construction phase. If we move to the operation phase, so residual impacts from operation, we expect an improved availability and condition of wetlands. So that broader benefit to wetland species, as I mentioned before, water birds and frogs, We're really looking to improve tree and habitat health, so that broader long-term benefit to woodland species. Prolonged survival of large trees, that's really what we're wanting to see, is that broader benefit to hollow-dependent species. So those large old trees need that environmental water at the appropriate frequency, duration, extent and timing. So that's important to those larger hollow-bearing trees. And improved availability and condition of wetlands, so that broader benefit to nearby Ramsar sites as well. So just as a bit of a summary, an overview of key findings for terrestrial fauna. So as I've mentioned, that localised and minor construction effects, we're going to see some small impacts to EPVC and FFG listed species within that construction footprint. So localised and minor construction effects on the Victorian temperate woodland bird community, but no forecast significant impacts during construction on species listed as migratory. Those species tend to use or utilise broader wetland habitats, and it's pretty unlikely that those habitats are going to be present within the construction footprints. No broader construction effects on Ramsar listed wetlands. So there's Gunbower Forest, but there's also the New South Wales Central Murray Forest nearby to the site. Minor construction effect on one nationally important wetland. I'm not going to go into major detail. Ms. Jelly's already explained that particular EVC, which is likely to be some minor changes to that EVC and probably moving it more back to what it would have been prior to river regulation. The operation of the project is not expected to result in adverse effects on flora and fauna, so it's more likely to provide benefits into the future. So those direct benefits to species that are going to respond rapidly, like frogs and water birds, and then those longer term benefits to woodland birds, reptiles and arboreal mammals. I'm just going to talk a little bit about post-exhibition activities. So obviously there was that exhibition period from the end of March through to the middle of May. I've reviewed the public submissions that are relevant to terrestrial fauna, and I've prepared my expert witness statement, so that's been filed. People likely read that, and I've included responses to the public submissions and also prepared this presentation. So I'm just going to talk to the submissions that are relevant to terrestrial fauna. So there's a range of different items that were raised. So there's been some concerns raised about potential woodland habitat loss to the superb parrot, painted honeyeater and Kreft's glider. So the superb parrot, it's a highly mobile species. So parrots in the genus Polytelus, which are superb parrot, regent parrot, princess parrot, they're highly mobile. They're a highly mobile species of parrot. Very fast flyers, move extensively throughout their habitat. As I mentioned before, superb parrot, the nearest known habitat where they breed is in excess of 40 kilometres to the east of Gunbower. So they're not known to breed in either of the sites. They were recorded within the area of investigation during the surveys, but that was sort of more incidentally between fauna survey sites. There was some concern raised about the sticky hotbush, so Dodonaea viscosa, in the vicinity of Camerons Creek. The superb parrot's been observed feeding on that species of shrub. They do, in fact, utilise a range of other species of shrub and fall as foraging or as a foraging source. In the recovery plan, it notes, I think, in excess of 8 different food plants for that species. Sticky hotbush is not actually noted as a plant that they're dependent on. However, they have been observed foraging on it. It's quite a common shrub, so it's quite unlikely that the removal of individual or small areas of that shrub would have a broader impact on that species, given its wide foraging preferences And Dodonea viscosa is quite a widespread shrub as well, so it's likely to be present throughout both the sites. Painted honeyeater, as I mentioned before, is highly nomadic, very responsive to mistletoe fruiting. So the study area, they haven't been recorded there. It's not really a known site for painted honeyeater. It's more likely somewhere like central Victoria around Mount Corong, north of Bendigo. That's a bit of a hotspot for painted honeyeater. Not really Gunbower and Guttrim Benwell. But there's potential they could occasionally occur there, but it's quite unlikely. No records in that particular area at this stage. And it's quite likely that the project, through the maintenance and enhancement of those habitats, may in fact provide habitat into the future for the painted honeyeater, given they rely on flushes of fruiting of mistletoe. In the submissions, sugar glider was actually mentioned. Now, the sugar glider has actually been split into 3 separate species in the last several years. So Kreft's glider is actually the species that occurs within the sites. It's a common non-threatened species that occurs throughout Eastern Australia. So it's not listed under any legislation. Look, it's quite unlikely that species would be negatively impacted by the project. They're pretty widespread and pretty adaptable, and highly likely to continue using the habitats within both sites. So I've pretty much covered that last point there in terms of overall impact. Moving on to the growling grass frog, Sloan's froglet, and waterbirds and migratory species. So there's some potential concern over habitat degradation during construction for these species or fauna groups. So the growling grass frog, currently not known from the project areas, so it hasn't been recorded. They're really distinctive species, quite a large species of frog, sort of females up to around 10 centimetres. They're readily detectable during their calling season, during their breeding season, which typically extends between sort of November through to the end of February. They can call outside that period as well, but that's generally their main sort of breeding season. Generally highly responsive to floodwaters or environmental water. I've certainly observed them responding very rapidly and favourably to environmental water in the past. They will respond, and they can move maybe 1 or 2 kilometres in an evening if the conditions are favourable. So they're very, very mobile. So not recorded at all at this point, but one would expect that with the objectives of this project being to provide that environmental water, it's likely that this species may in fact recolonise these areas into the future. Sloan's froglet has been recorded recently at Guttrim and Benwell. That was recorded during the TLM frog monitoring that was undertaken recently. So they are known from that area. Look, it's highly unlikely that they be impacted by the construction within the construction footprint. They tend to prefer damp, inundated areas. It's unlikely that they're going to occur within the construction footprint. And there was a range of other, I guess, water-dependent species that were noted as well. So white-bellied seagull and Australasian bittern. I guess they are incorrectly noted as migratory within the submissions. They're not listed as migratory species. But both species, again, would be expected to respond favourably to this project, and that's what we predicted through our assessment. The osprey is more of a coastal species. It was raised as potentially impacted by the construction. This would be highly unlikely. The ospreys would be a vagrant species at best to inland waters. They're not generally known from inland waters. And, they make occasional trips inland to some of the major waterways, but yeah, they're very unlikely to occur at the sites. Balin's crake are considered migratory. they're not now listed as threatened under Victorian legislation. But I think importantly for all of the species, whether they're frogs or waterbirds, they'd be predicted to benefit from the project and respond favourably to managed environmental water events. So there are other concerns raised about the broad-shelled turtle and the platypus, and that was mainly around habitat loss and pest fauna expansion. So it was noted that there could be a risk of ecological effects on suitable habitat for the platypus, and that was particularly around the Camerons Creek area. It's worth noting that there's no recent records documented for the platypus in that particular area. And any expected impacts to Camerons Creek would be quite short-term in nature, and that particular area is connected to the Murray River Weir Pool, so any changes in water level would be temporary in nature. So impacts to the platypus would likely be quite minor. Broad-shelled turtle is the other species that was mentioned. So the project is highly likely to provide additional habitat for the broad-shelled turtle. And in particular, it was noted in submission 12 from DECA that it's unlikely there'd be suitable habitat for the broad-shelled turtle in the vicinity of the construction footprints. So impacts to broad-shelled turtle would be unlikely from the construction process. It's well known that the primary threat for this species and other species of turtle is predation of nests by foxes and feral pigs. So we do know that these species do occur within the sites, but increases in pest populations are considered unlikely with the implementation of a specific EDS E3, which will be in place to monitor and respond to any increases in pest fauna populations. So I'm confident that's going to be put in place for us to ensure that there's no increase in pest abundance, further impact the broad-shelled turtle. So loss of hollow-bearing trees at both sites, that was something that was raised as a potential concern. Look, so we know, as I mentioned before, there's going to be those localised impacts at discrete areas. So it's worth noting that they are quite localised in nature compared to the presence of hollow-bearing trees across the broader area of both of the sites. It's quite small in comparison. So we assess that as unlikely to have a significant impact on any populations of species to the extent that population viability would be threatened. So it's worth noting, and I know a lot of you have been to site now, so you'll understand that these areas are large, they're quite extensive, and hollow-bearing trees are relatively abundant within these landscapes. So it's worth understanding that. So we acknowledge it will be an impact, but that loss of hollows at a landscape scale is small compared to the overall maintenance and enhancement of hollow-bearing trees and the hollow-bearing trees of the future within these sites. I guess that's an important point to make, that yes, we will lose some, but overall we're looking to protect a much larger area of habitat for hollow-dependent fauna. And look, there has been, again, put forward the potential for a hollow replacement plan. I've had some direct experience with hollow replacement projects in the past. I was involved had a project for Living Murray, and a range of nest boxes were put up at Messenger's regulator and OT's regulators, and we monitored the uptake and use of those nest boxes for region parrot. What we found was that the region parrots, we monitored them prior to construction and then post-construction, and the parrots continued to nest at a similar frequency, both pre and post-construction. So clearly they were utilising other natural hollows within the vicinity. There didn't seem to be a lot of nest box uptake, although what we did note was was what appeared to be dead chicks within a number of the nest boxes, which clearly they'd potentially passed away during the warmer weather. So we actually recommended those nest boxes be taken down, which they have. So I've also had some other experience with hollow replacement in the past as well, and it's largely been unsuccessful. So I think the important point to note is hollow replacement is not a simple task. It's highly complex, and it needs to be targeted. It needs to be targeted to a specific species if it's going to be undertaken. And sometimes this sort of approach can also have some perverse outcomes as well. So provide habitat for things like feral bees, Indian miners. So while the best intentions might be to provide habitat for a specific target species, should I say, the outcomes could be less desirable and not achieve the intended mitigation. Moving on to the environmental delivery standards. Look, I won't go into too much detail on these because others have mentioned these, but there's a range of EDSs that are implemented during construction. Some, such as pest animal monitoring and management, will be implemented both during construction and during operation. And really they're in place to continue that avoid and minimise piece, where we're trying to avoid and minimise impacts to fauna. And also that operational phase is more about administering environmental water, the appropriate frequency, duration, timing and extent. And these are a couple of EDSs in a little bit more detail there. That first one we've spoken about, which is that avoid, minimise piece during that detailed design phase. The construction biodiversity management subplan, or the flora fauna management subplan, should I say, produced. And something we haven't spoken about is this construction fauna management plan. So that's where we're undertaking pre-clearance surveys. So we've got ecologists coming in, rescuing and moving animals prior to construction, identifying habitat and hollow-bearing trees, and then removing and relocating fauna prior to the actual construction process. And we've got construction weed and pest management. So that's really managing hygiene during the construction phase. So we're not wanting things like chytrid fungus, which has been a terrible pathogen for frog populations all over the world. So not wanting to spread things like that. So there's hygiene protocols in place. And then we've got the pest, plant and animal monitoring and management plan, which is really monitoring pest plants and animals and then responding to any potential increases. As I mentioned before, that final one is more about delivering environmental water at the appropriate frequency, duration and timing that meets the ecological needs of the habitats and species present within each of these sites. So fauna monitoring, we have mentioned monitoring. So there'll be monitoring of pests during the construction phase. So obviously we don't want to increase the chance that waste and things like that are present during the construction phase leads to any increase in pest fauna. And then we're monitoring during the operational phase as well. So we're looking at increases in pest herbivores, pest predators, and responding to those through those EDSs. And then we're also really wanting to monitor any responses to the environmental water as well. So a lot of this is already happening. I mentioned the Sloan's froglet records from the monitoring that have been undertaken. So some of the baseline work's already happening, but some of the main fauna groups we're monitoring are wetland birds, woodland birds and frogs. So we're looking at a response to the environmental water and seeing how those groups respond into the future. And that's it from me.
Well, thanks very much. That's everything, Chief.
Okay, no problem. We'll just keep going, given I understand you've got maybe about 10 minutes left. Yeah.
Yep.
So go ahead. Thanks, Mr. Shinkle.
Were you involved in the Hatter Lakes case study?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. Did you survey for koalas in the project area?
We would have, yeah. Like, I wasn't involved in that survey specifically, but we were looking for everything, so we would have been looking for koalas as well.
Isn't it the case that koalas are not mentioned in your expert witness statement?
That's correct, but I refer to arboreal mammals, so that would be covered effectively in that.
Is the region honeyeater in the project area?
Not that I'd be aware of. That Chiltern Mount pilot area is a sort of stronghold for that species in Victoria.
What are the habitat requirements of Corbyn's long-eared bat? Are they a cave dweller, hollows, or do they live under bark?
Hollows.
Hollow dwelling species, yep. Okay. Now, migratory birds, would you envisage they would arrive different species at different times of the year? Different species driving all through the year?
Yeah, it's generally sort of staged, I guess, during the warmer months. So from October to March we would potentially expect migratory species to move through that area, migratory shorebirds. Yeah.
And what would your response be to their arrival of migratory bird species?
How do you mean my response?
Well, in consideration of the recent protocols established for bird flu.
Sorry?
The recent protocols established for bird flu.
Oh, for bird flu.
I'm not sure that question sort of relates to the project.
Well, if the migratory species are to arrive at the site, and migratory species being a vector for bird flu, there is a protocol in.
I'm not disagreeing that there's a protocol and this is happening. It's more just the relationship between that and the works that are occurring as part of this project. So, yeah, just I'm not dismissing it as a thing that's happening. It's just, yeah, we just have to focus on the sort of things that are arising because of the project. Yeah.
And it relates to koalas either, but anyway.
Well, you said that twice now. Can I respond to that? Question while we're here. We were invited to make a submission to this.
I'd encourage it because this gentleman's acting for a particular body that focuses on a particular species. It's apparent that he's interested in a whole range of other things. And he's asked one question about koalas. And like that question is a good example of one. How does it relate to koalas?
Okay. Well, I think we'll continue. I think it's only a few questions, so we'll continue, and we're happy to hear in your submissions.
Yes, that's a good place.
If there's details. Thanks.
That's it then.
Oh, that's the only question. Okay. All right. Okay. Member Elliott, sorry.
I heard your evidence about the hollows and the tree and habitats. DECA suggest a hollow tree replacement plan. Is it fair to say then that you would disagree with DECA's suggestion?
Look, I don't disagree with it, but in these sorts of systems, I think it's very difficult to achieve. So, for example, you'll see hollow replacement plans will be put forward that are supposed to achieve mitigation for a bat, a large forest owl, a large cockatoo, a small parrot. Like, how do you achieve hollow replacement for all those different species when they all require very different things? So I think they could be useful in an environment where there aren't a lot of hollows available. But in environments such as this, I wonder whether they're going to achieve the outcome that you're trying to seek. So in an environment like this, yeah, you need to be very targeted in what you want to do. Like in WA, if you're trying to achieve mitigation for the loss of a tree for a Carnaby's black cockatoo, for example, like it's well known what their nesting requirements are. So you can design something very specific for that particular species. Palm cockatoo up in Northern Australia, like everybody understands what they require. Whereas here, something like a carpet python, there's very little information available. on what a carpet python requires. Yes, it can use a hollow, but it can live under a log, in a hollow within a log. It can live in low dense shrubbery. Like there's so much unknown about a lot of these species. Corbyn's long-eared bat. There's been a lot of research done on Corbyn's long-eared bat, but we still don't really know exactly what they use. I've done pre-clearance surveys in Corbyn's long-eared bat habitat, and I've only encountered a couple of Corbyn's long-eared bats in that entire time. So I just worry that can you actually achieve what you've set out to do, or are you going to create a whole heap of habitat for brush-tailed possums? Or, you might see, again, some perverse outcomes where you've got species that are highly adaptable might end up using the hollows rather than your target species.
Yeah, thank you. That explains that. The last question I have, your slides on PDF 13 and 15 state that there's all positive and strongly positive responses to the project. And then on page 16, you show medium residual risk rating for operation. I'm just trying to understand how we get to that. It might be the way I've looked at it. Thanks.
Oh yeah, okay. Did you want me to pull that slide?
Oh, if it helps everyone else, I've got it in front of me.
Give us those numbers.
Oh, so page or PDF 13.
Oh, I can see it, yeah.
You've got an overview of key findings, which I'm looking at that is a lot of strongly positive under the different scenarios and positive. And then you flick down to page 16 that says overview of effects. And I'm just focusing on the operation here because I understand the difference with construction and operation. That you've got medium residual risk rating. So I'm just trying to.
Oh yeah, yeah. So that now too says never do. Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at how we actually assessed it, but it could have something to do with potential pests and things like that. I'd need to go back and look at the actual risk assessment. I can do that if you'd like me to.
And so could I just,
Yeah.
I thought if you had that off the top of your head.
I need to look at all the different.
Okay.
See how we came
So
up.
so is the answer potentially in the methodology?
Could be, yeah.
Thanks. That's all.
I don't have any questions either, so just re-examination.
Yeah, that exercise to go and check that report back to the committee, how long do you think you would need to do that? Is that something that
I could go and look at it today, this afternoon.
what estimate of time would you need? Like, is it 5 minutes or 2 hours?
It might take me an hour to look. Yeah.
Really just a matter for the committee. Would you like the witness to do it and come back in front of you
Or
live?
if it's only 1 hour, and do you understand the question of why I'm seeing and asking
Yeah,
that question?
no, we are.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's fine.
So perhaps if you
It would be
took a
helpful.
break and he came back,
Yeah,
or the alternative would be he goes and does it and reports to you in writing, but you might have subsequent questions. So
might be easier for just to come, I mean, we're obviously running ahead of schedule. I've got another question for you, more a procedural one, so maybe we will have a lunch break and then just come back for an hour to have a look.
Yeah,
Hopefully,
I think
is that enough?
the report,
Is that enough, like, just
Should
be
be,
realistic if we give it an hour, is that,
Should be able to find
do you
it.
want to make it an hour and a half, just to
Maybe
be
an hour and a
safe?
half.
We can do that, just, so we'll,
I'll just have to dig into the methodology again just to see.
Yeah,
how
I
the
think-
ratings again, but yeah.
we might just come back at 2:30, just to give enough time for that. Does that suit, I'm assuming everyone else has had time for today? Happy to have a break?
Done what I have to do, I won't be back.
Okay, all right,
till next week.
no problem, all right. Okay, we'll have a,
I had a couple other things.
oh,
I
sorry,
can do
yes.
with-
Yes, no problem.
Remember Elliot asked you a question about the hollows, and in answer to it, you said something like, in an environment where there's not a lot of hollows, and just for the committee's purposes, how does this project area compare on that relative scale in terms of an area where you described as not having a lot of hollows? Is this an area where it doesn't have a lot of hollows, or is it
I think it
relative to that?
these are areas that do have a lot of hollows. Yeah, all of the VMFRP sites have an abundance of hollows.
And you were also asked a question about the DECA submission and the management plan, but one of the examples you pointed to was if the hollows that are created, as I understood, you're trying to deal with a broad range of species, created habitat, and I think you pointed to a particular type of possum.
Yep.
And I assume that's habitat would be, intended for flying animals largely. But is that something that might lead to environmental consequences if that was to occur?
I think that's what I was saying. I was using the example of a more common species that could occupy those replacement hollows rather than the intended species. So something like a brush-tailed possum is highly adaptable, very common. So you might end up with a situation where you're creating hollows for other species or other target species, and then those hollows in effect become occupied by common species.
And if I just stick with that possum, like if I pick a particular tree that's got an artificial hollow that's been created intended for a particular bird, and the possum then takes over, what does that mean for that particular bird?
It's got to go find an alternative location, or whether it would ever occupy that to begin with. It just means it's not available for it.
Okay, well, thank you.
I had one more question, which I can't remember whether you covered off at the beginning, so I'm just going to ask it now. It was just about the EDS, if you've looked at the day one version of the EDS and whether there was any changes relative to your area. Okay, all right. Sorry, I should have asked it earlier. Okay. The other procedural thing that's just popped up, and I don't have the full picture, so I'm just going to give you an overview and we might have to follow up in writing. But Ms. Peace is scheduled to call her witness, Dr. Pardo, tomorrow, and she's indicated that she's unwell and might not be able to be present. I'm not exactly sure whether she's able to sort of tune in online to listen or whether it's complete absence. Just, you don't have to give me an answer now, but just looking for your views on whether there might be a process, just proposing a process whereby the committee hears from the witness and does the introductory stuff, that she's online or is able to listen to a recording afterwards so that we can just have both of the witnesses together, if you'd be comfortable with that from the proponent's perspective, and then Ms. Peace would make her submissions at a later point in time when she's feeling better.
Yeah.
It's a bit unusual, but I'm just...
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. The lunch break might provide an opportunity for, we'd had some indications of that. We just don't understand.
I haven't got the full picture either, so yeah.
Maybe the lunch break might allow some more communications with her, just to see the situation. But our immediate reaction, we don't want to sort of stand on ceremony, but we don't want to have a procedural difficulty potentially arise. We think that someone's actually got to call Dr. Pardew because he's not a submitter. We could have a look at the terms to see whether the committee's got the power to effectively call him.
Yeah, we'll...
I think our preference would be if Ms. Peace was available, even online, to call the witness. If the witness is in person, she can be online. It's a hybrid hearing. That could work perfectly fine. That would be our preference to do it tomorrow. Yeah. If not, I think we'd unfortunately have to try and find some sort of way of rescheduling, which has got its own complications.
We'll have a look at the terms over the lunch break as well, just to sort of see if there's a way around this. But yeah, we'll come back. I think we'll have a longer lunch break, give Mr. Holmes a little bit of time to have a look. Unless we'll come back. Maybe we come back and deal with that at 2:15 and then bring Mr. Holmes back at 2:30. Does that work? Or
yes.
Do you want to have a chat to him?
That's fine.
I'll try and find that as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I don't want to rush you too much, but we'll resume at 2:15 and then if you're available, just come in at 2:30.
The other possibility, but I'm not, Peace would have to engage in this, was whether she then transferred Dr. do in her part of her submission. But I think that procedurally we can fall into difficulty if we have any discussions about that without her participating. It'd have to be her choice. At the moment, he's not a submitter, he's an expert.
Yes, yes. All right, okay, we'll have a think about that over the lunch break as well, and maybe we can deal with it then. Okay.
The only other thing, if I could flag, was the timetable had us
Yeah, I was going to mention
our
Yeah.
Part B at noon on Friday. I just asked that be shifted over to at the moment. If you had in your mind that was noon on Monday, there's something different changes.
say that again. You want to
Direction number 30 is requiring us to file our Part B at noon on Friday.
Yes.
That's when we were going to be delivering on the Monday.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're delivering on the Tuesday.
Oh, I think we'd already agreed to that. Yeah, that's fine. One other timetabling thing while we're on timetable. Yeah, actually, no, because just looking at tomorrow, we'd already anticipated that Miss Ottaway could be starting at 10. So I think we'll stick to the original timetable. But that might be something else. We'll just check if if he gets called in whatever capacity that is, if he can come a little bit earlier as well.
Yeah.
So
Might make it like a rolling timetable.
yes.
So
Okay. All right. We'll have a break now and we'll think about those things over the break. Thanks, Mr. Shinkle, for coming along, and we'll see you next time you're here. All right. Thank you. I can see Mr. Holmes is here. Do we want to? Oh, sorry. Someone's got their mic on. I think it's PK.
That's me.
Okay. Testing. Yeah, testing. That seems to be working again now. Okay. Since Mr. Holmes is back, we might just hear from him first, and then we can do the administrative things afterwards. So, thanks, Mr. Holmes.
Yes, so in reference to your question, so you're referring to the table where I was looking in my presentation about some of the predicted responses to environmental water. And we said for water birds and other species, or for water birds and frogs, it'd be strongly positive. For terrestrial species, arboreal, mammals, those other fauna groups, we expected a strong or a positive response, should I say. And I believe your question was for native species, why we had a residual impact of medium into that. Is that correct?
Yeah, the difference between those two tables.
Yep. So just referring to this table here, I think it's table 7.2 in the specialist assessment.
This would be specialist assessment B, is it?
Yes. I think it's page 314, 315 roughly. Table 7.2. So for native species, we assessed a range of different impact pathways. But I think the important thing to note is this is a cumulative of both flora and fauna. So say, for example, a lot of these are driven, or that they're an average residual risk of medium. Some of them were low for fauna. So, for example, that third row down, you can see pest, plants and animals and pathogens. So for fauna, we said the likelihood was possible, whereas for flora, it was likely. So although it was a low impact for fauna, we ended up with a residual risk of medium because we're looking at both flora and fauna. And if you look at that last column there, even though you've got some residual risks of low, I guess the average across the 11 different impact pathways resulted in an overall medium risk. So that's why we ended up with a medium risk as an average result.
What's the table number you're looking at there?
It's table 7.2, I believe. Let me have a look here. Yeah, 7-2, summary of effect pathways.
Page number is 345 there, I'm reading. PDF 345, or Mr. Forrester might have it.
The extract that Mr. Hunt was going to is at page 308 or PDF page 348.
So just to clarify then, Mr. Holmes, the second lot of tables in the presentation relates to an outcome of flora and fauna, but your first table is really about fauna.
That's right, yes. Yeah, so the first table was more about the responses to environment and water specifically, whereas the second one was more about various impact pathways that are predicted to occur.
All right, well, unless there's anything else, can Mr. Holmes be excused?
That's fine.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for doing that on the break.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, just moving on to the combination of procedural and administrative matters. Did you have any views on Dipesa's request about calling Dr. Pardo or not calling? We've had to think about it, but it's just...
I think no change from this morning that I think we're better off adopting a safe course. I think the committee can inform itself as it sees fit. You've got a witness statement that's been filed. I think at the theoretical level you could yourselves call him for you to inform yourselves. I think the safer course is to have Ms. Peace call him in a formal sense, so that there's no cause for. I'm also conscious that she's not here, that there's no cause for her to complain or raise a procedural concern about what we're doing this afternoon, or if you were to call Dr. Pascoe, that she might feel like she's agreed to doing something procedurally. So because she's not here, I guess we could revisit it again in the morning and see where we're up to. If there's any more information that comes to light from her, I might invite Mr. Bartley, our instructor, to see if he can make contact with her, just to see what the position is. As I'm instructed, she's making contact with like a query line at our client, and rather than going directly to Mr. Bartley, I'm not sure if, I don't think she's listening, but if there's someone associated with Ms. Peace that is listening to me, could I extend an invitation for her to engage directly with Mr. Bartley? It'll just save a few different message paths. But Mr. Bartley might just reach out to her and see how she's tracking, whether that hybrid sort of option might be one for tomorrow, where if she's ill but she's able to appear online, we call Dr. Pardew and we're doing tomorrow. But if not, then we'll have to work out what to do. But it's looking something like putting them into next Tuesday or Wednesday, I suppose.
Okay, thank you. I think we've had a look at our terms.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Unless you wanted to call back Monday afternoon, but it might be that.
Yeah.
I've got other complications now that that's been vacated.
Yeah. I think we had a look at our terms of reference and also the directions, and there's nothing in there to suggest that we can't, I don't say, call a witness. And we have a strong preference for Dr. Pardo to turn up at the same time we're hearing from Ms. Ottaway, who I don't think is here anymore. So What we were thinking is, like, in terms of, I understand your point about the risks around it. I think the only person that's likely to be disadvantaged is probably Ms. Peace herself. And so what we might do is just confirm in writing that the proposal would be that the committee hears from Dr. Pardo. We'll sort of introduce him, check for corrections and do all those things at the beginning, and then we'll flag that with Ms. Peace, but we're also going to direct that she needs to listen, whether she can do it tomorrow or if she has to listen to the recording to make sure she's actually listened to what her witness said before she makes a submission. And if we put that in writing to her, I think that will cover off if she's got a concern from a procedural perspective and doesn't want to go down that path, then we'll deal with that at that point in time, but just give her a chance to do that. And I think Ms. Selvaraj is also trying to make contact with her at the moment to just sort of talk about the logistics, and we'll liaise with Mr. Bartley either way if whatever happens. Yeah.
Look, I'm conscious that Ms. Peace kind of raised that suggestion in her initial request.
Yeah.
But I just wouldn't like a situation to arise where what we're doing this afternoon and tomorrow leads to a procedural complaint later.
Yeah, and we'll make sure we put it back to her and that she understands the process. I just think from a practical point of view, and also it would help by the time you get to your submissions that we've heard that material as well. So we'll put that all in writing and make sure everyone is across it. And sort of related to that, we're also proposing that we'll actually start a little bit later tomorrow. So we'll start at 1 o'clock. So if you could ask Miss Odaway to turn up at 1, because then we're not sure of Dr. Pardo's availability, but we'll just try and stick to that sort of afternoon time slot so we're not messing around with too many timetabling things. And it will also give a chance if Ms. Peace is unwell and, just give her enough time to read what we're saying, check if she's got any concerns in there. Yeah. The other thing that has happened, I don't know when the correspondence came through, but we understand that Mr. Pardo has also filed some material. I haven't actually looked at it because we're not sure whether it's new material or a presentation. So what we're going to just not table it until tomorrow, and we'll just confirm with him whether he's just send out a little reminder saying that he needs to present based on the material that he's filed previously. And if that is, just to clarify that that's not new material. If it's not new, we'll table it after tomorrow. But we haven't looked at it at this stage. It just looks like another sort of written document. So that's what we're proposing to do. I'm just checking if you had any views on that or if you've looked at that material.
It's only just hit my inbox now. If I could just have 1 minute just to glance over it. Could we just adopt your approach? Just let him explain
we're not
what it is.
sure.
Yeah.
And just we're happy for him to clarify tomorrow if it's not new. We'll do that. Okay, no problem. Okay, so I've covered off that. So the other thing, still on the topic of Dr. Pardo, the questions that Ms. Halden sent around, we've circulated them to, I think it's been tabled, so it's document 67. Just given Ms. Peace may be unwell, we're also going to send a copy directly to Dr. Pardo. I think we've got his contact details just to make sure he's got them before tomorrow. And as mentioned, we'll start at 1 p.m. tomorrow instead of 10, and we'll send out something to all the parties so they know. Now, the other thing I just wanted to check in with, just in terms of timetabling for next Tuesday with your main submissions, we've got a day allocated. Just checking if you...
We won't need any more than 2 hours, and we probably won't need 2 hours.
Okay. Just considering it in terms of if we need to reschedule Miss Peace as well. So would you like to start at 10 a.m?
Maybe. Could we see where we're up to, 10 past 1 tomorrow? It might be that...
10 past 1. I'll put an alarm on my computer.
Let's say we do with Dr. Party tomorrow, Miss Peace needs a slot. It might be that we could cope with her on that Tuesday morning.
Yeah.
And then deal with it if we can, but if not, put a hand up and say we need a little bit more time to deal with her submission, but otherwise deal with all the other matters.
Okay, all right. Just so we know, probably not going to be having a full day on the Tuesday then. That's fine. Okay. All right, that was all the things, I think, from our side. Was there anything else you wanted to deal with?
I'll just raise it with you. I don't think I need your permission for it, but the document that Dr. Pardo's produced, Ms. Ottaway hasn't seen it, but we might give it to her overnight for her to have a look at.
It's not, I think it's in the to be tabled file, so maybe we'll leave it there until we hear from him, but yes, anyone can access that. So, yeah, no, that's fine. All right, well, we'll come back. No, I'm just going to check. We'll come back at 1 p.m. tomorrow. We'll send out correspondence just confirming what the plan is. And if we hear back from anyone in the meantime and anyone's got a concern, we'll just make sure that that correspondence is circulated and we're ready to hear from around cultural heritage. So,
Well, thanks to the committee for its flexibility.
no worries. Okay, thank you.